In the misty harbors of the Netherlands, where the scent of salt mingles with the creaking of ancient timber, lie stories of a maritime world both fascinating and strange. As we drift into these tales of the sea, let the gentle rhythm of waves against weathered hulls carry you into the peculiar world of Dutch sailors and their curious customs of discipline. Close your eyes. Let the fog of history envelop you as we explore these forgotten corners of the ocean's memory. The morning mist clings to the Amsterdam harbor like a shroud of secrets, its tendrils weaving between the forest of masts that rise from the water like the bare branches of winter trees. In this year of our Lord 1723, the Dutch Republic stands as a maritime colossus, where ships bearing precious cargo across oceans that stretch beyond the imagination of landlocked souls. Yet, within the gentle lapping of waves against weathered hulls, lies a world governed by customs as peculiar as they are necessary. Picture, if you will, the Zuiderzee on a quiet dawn, its waters reflecting the pale amber light of sunrise. The air carries the mingled scents of tar and rope, of exotic spices from distant Indies, and the ever-present salt that seems to permeate every surface, every breath, every thought of those who make their living upon the restless sea. Here, in this watery realm, the rules of land hold little sway, and new codes of conduct emerge. As naturally as barnacles upon a ship's hull, the vessels that crowd these Dutch harbors are marvels of human ingenuity. Their oak frames seasoned by Baltic winters and their canvas sails, woven by the patient hands of Amsterdam seamstresses. Each ship represents months of labor, forests of trees, and the accumulated wisdom of generations of shipwrights, who understood that these floating worlds must be entirely self-sufficient once they slip beyond the sight of land. From the massive East Indiamen that tower above the harbor like floating castles to the nimble flight ships designed for efficient cargo transport, each vessel carries within its wooden walls a complete society with its own rules, hierarchies, and systems of justice. The Dutch sailor of this era is a unique breed, shaped by a culture that values both commercial success and Calvinist discipline. Unlike his English or Spanish counterparts, the Dutch seaman often comes from a society where trade and respectability walk hand in hand, where the merchant class enjoys unprecedented influence, and where the principles of hard work and moral rectitude are woven into the very fabric of daily life. Yet the sea transforms all who venture upon it, creating a brotherhood bound not by birth or wealth, but by shared hardship and mutual dependence. As we stand upon the cobblestones of the Amsterdam waterfront, watching the endless parade of sailors, merchants, and dock workers, we might observe the curious ritual of departure that precedes each voyage. Ships do not simply slip their moorings and vanish into the gray horizon. Rather, they undergo a transformation from creatures of the land to denizens of the deep. Cargo must be secured with mathematical precision, provisions calculated to the last biscuit, and most importantly, the articles of conduct must be read aloud to every soul who will call the vessel home. These articles, written in the careful script of ships' clerks and bearing the official seals of the Dutch West India Company, or the VOC, contain more than simple rules of navigation and commerce. They outline a complete system of governance. For communities that may spend months beyond the reach of any earthly authority, save their own, within these documents lie the seeds of the peculiar punishments that we shall explore. Regulations born from the practical necessities of maintaining order among men confined within the wooden walls of ships, no larger than a modest farmhouse. The hierarchy aboard a Dutch vessel follows patterns as rigid as those found in any earthly kingdom, yet tempered by the practical realities of life at sea. At the apex stands the captain, a figure who combines the authority of a judge, the wisdom of a father, and the strategic mind of a military commander. Below him, the officers maintain their careful ranks. The first mate with his weather-beaten hands and encyclopedic knowledge of winds and currents, the boatswain who governs the mysterious world of ropes and rigging, the quartermaster who guards the precious stores that mean the difference between a successful voyage and disaster. Yet it is among the common sailors that we find the most fascinating subjects of our tale. These men, drawn from the fishing villages of Zealand, the bustling streets of Rotterdam, and sometimes the farthest corners of Europe bring with them a mixture of skills, superstitions, and expectations that must somehow be molded into a functioning crew. They are rope makers and net menders, farmers' sons seeking adventure, and occasionally gentlemen who have fallen upon hard times and found refuge in the democracy of dangerous work. The transformation that occurs when a ship leaves port is remarkable to contemplate. The familiar landmarks of home fade into memory, replaced by an endless expanse of water that can be both calm and terrifyingly violent. The solid ground beneath one's feet gives way to a deck that pitches and rolls with every wave, creating a sensation that landlubbers often find deeply unsettling. Yet for the experienced sailor, this motion becomes as natural as breathing, constant reminder that they now inhabit a world governed by different laws and different possibilities. In this floating world, the usual social distinctions of land-based society begin to blur and reshape themselves. A man's worth is measured not by his birth or his purse, but by his ability to work aloft in a howling gale, to read the subtle signs that predict changes in weather, to remain steady when others succumb to panic. Yet with this democracy of danger comes the absolute necessity of maintaining order for aboard a ship. A single act of defiance or negligence can doom every soul who calls the vessel home. The Dutch approach to naval discipline reflects the broader characteristics of their society: practical, methodical, and tinged with the moral certainty that comes from Calvinist teachings about duty and redemption. Unlike the often brutal punishments favored by other maritime nations, Dutch naval justice tends toward the inventive, the symbolic, and the oddly therapeutic. This is not to say that Dutch discipline is lenient, quite the contrary, but it reflects a culture that believes in the power of shame, the importance of community approval, and the possibility that even the most wayward sailor might be reformed through properly applied correction. As evening falls over the harbor and the last light fades from the western sky, we can imagine the conversations that take place in the cramped quarters below deck. Veterans of previous voyages share stories with newcomers, tales that serve both as entertainment and as informal education about the realities of life at sea. Among these stories, whispered in the flickering light of oil lamps, are accounts of the strange and sometimes humorous punishments that await those who violate the ship's articles. These tales, passed from sailor to sailor like a peculiar form of oral literature, serve as both warning and reassurance, reminding listeners that while justice at sea may be swift and certain, it is also tempered by an understanding of human frailty. The Dutch maritime world of the 18th century represents a fascinating intersection of old and new, where medieval concepts of honor and shame meet the practical demands of global commerce, where Calvinist morality encounters the ancient lawlessness of the sea, and where the need for discipline must be balanced against the necessity of maintaining morale among men far from home. It is within this complex matrix of competing demands that the peculiar punishments we shall explore found their place, serving not merely as deterrents to bad behavior, but as rituals that reinforce the unique social bonds that made survival possible in the vast loneliness of the ocean. As we prepare to delve deeper into this strange world, imagine yourself standing on the deck of a Dutch merchantman as it slips its moorings and begins its journey toward the open sea. Feel the gentle roll of the deck beneath your feet. Smell the salt air that will be your constant companion for months to come. And listen to the creaking of rigging and the soft splash of waves against the bow. In this moment of departure, anything seems possible, and the familiar rules of land begin their slow transformation into something altogether. It's more mysterious and compelling. The sun sets behind the Dutch coast, painting the sky in shades of amber, and rose, and our vessel turns its bow toward horizons that promise both fortune and adventure. Yet as the lights of home fade into darkness, every soul aboard knows that they are now citizens of a different world, one where survival depends upon cooperation, where justice takes forms unknown to landlubbers, and where the peculiar and the necessary often walk hand in hand through the endless watches of the night. The cock's crow that awakens farmers in the Dutch countryside finds no echo aboard the ships that rock gently in distant waters, where time is measured not by the familiar rhythms of sunrise and sunset, but by the eternal cycle of watches that divide each day into segments of duty and rest. As the boatswain's whistle pierces the pre-dawn darkness, calling the men from their hammocks to face another day upon the endless sea. We begin to understand the harsh realities that shaped every aspect of life aboard these floating communities. In the belly of the ship, where the curve of the hull creates spaces so cramped that a tall man cannot stand upright, dozens of sailors swing gently in their hammocks like cocoons, suspended between the wooden ribs of some great beast. The air here is thick with the mingled scents of unwashed bodies, damp wool, tar, and the ever-present bilge water that seeps between the planks below. Each man claims a space no larger than a coffin, marked by a small sea chest that contains all his worldly possessions, perhaps a spare shirt, a knife, a prayer book, and letters from home that grow more precious with each passing day. The daily ration of food that sustains these men would seem meager too. Those accustomed to the abundance of Dutch farms and markets, ship's biscuit, hard as stones and often riddled with weevils, forms the foundation of every meal. These biscuits, baked in the great ovens of Amsterdam and other port cities, are designed to resist spoilage during long voyages, but they surrender to moisture and insects with depressing regularity. The experienced sailor learns to tap his biscuit against the table before eating, listening for the telltale sound of hollow spaces where worms have made their homes, and develops the philosophical acceptance that protein comes in many forms. When one is far from land, salt pork and beef preserved in barrels thick with brine provide the primary source of meat, though the salt required for preservation often renders these provisions nearly inedible. The cook, working in a galley no larger than a merchant's closet, performs daily miracles of transformation, attempting to render these preserved meats into something resembling nourishment. Water, stored in wooden casks that inevitably develop, leaks and harbor algae, becomes increasingly precious as voyages stretch beyond their planned duration. Each sailor receives his carefully measured ration, and the ship's officers guard the water. Barrels with the vigilance usually reserved for chests of gold. The work itself shapes every waking moment aboard these vessels, creating a rhythm as regular and inexorable as the tides. The rigging of an 18th century ship represents a marvel of engineering complexity, with hundreds of ropes, each with its specific name and function, creating a three-dimensional puzzle that must be mastered by every sailor who hopes to survive his first storm. The Dutch, with their characteristic attention to detail and systematic approach to complex problems, have developed training methods that transform farm boys and city dwellers into skilled mariners with remarkable efficiency. Aloft in the rigging, 50 feet above the deck, sailors work with the casual confidence of those who have learned to trust their lives to rope and timber. The motion of the ship, barely noticeable on deck, becomes amplified in the heights, creating a swaying, dizzying dance that would terrify landsmen. Yet here, among the maze of ropes and canvas, these men perform the delicate ballet of seamanship, adjusting sails to catch every breath of wind, repairing damage inflicted by storms, and maintaining the complex web of rigging that transforms the raw power of the wind into forward motion. The holy stoning of the deck, a daily ritual that keeps the wooden planks clean and white, provides a meditation on the endless nature of shipboard maintenance. Using blocks of sandstone, often nicknamed prayer books for the kneeling position required to use them effectively, sailors scrub every inch of the deck until it achieves the pale perfection that marks a well-maintained vessel. This work, performed in the gray light of dawn while the officers inspect the previous day's repairs, creates a sense of shared purpose and pride that transcends the monotony of the task itself. Personal hygiene, taken for granted by those who live within reach of Dutch bathhouses and clean linen, becomes a constant challenge aboard ship. Fresh water is far too precious to waste on washing, and most sailors must content themselves with occasional rinses in seawater, which leaves the skin sticky with salt and provides little relief from the accumulation of grime that comes from working with tar, rope, and canvas. Clothing, limited to what each man can carry in his sea chest, must serve for months without proper washing, leading to a democratic sharing of various parasites and a general acceptance of odors that would be intolerable on land. The lack of privacy aboard ship creates its own peculiar challenges. As men accustomed to the solitude of their own cottages, must learn to live in constant proximity to their shipmates. Every conversation is overheard. Every personal habit becomes common knowledge. And every conflict has the potential to affect the mood and efficiency of the entire crew. The wise sailor learns the art of mental withdrawal, finding inner solitude. Even when surrounded by dozens of companions, while developing the tolerance and diplomacy necessary for survival in such intimate quarters, sleep, when it comes, offers little respite from the harsh realities of shipboard life. The hammocks, ingeniously designed to compensate for the ship's motion, nonetheless, provide an unstable bed that takes considerable practice to master. The noise of the ship, the creaking of timbers, the splash of waves, the footsteps of the watch on deck above creates a constant symphony that penetrates even the deepest slumber. Many sailors develop the ability to sleep through the normal sounds of shipboard life while remaining instantly alert to any unusual noise that might signal danger or the call to duty. The psychological toll of confinement within the wooden walls of a ship cannot be underestimated. Men accustomed to the vast skies and varied landscapes of the Netherlands find themselves imprisoned within a space smaller than many Dutch gardens, surrounded always by the same faces, the same routines, the same endless expanse of empty ocean. The horizon, which should represent infinite possibility, becomes instead a circular prison wall that moves with the ship, but never changes, never offers the hope of something new or different beyond its edge. Disease spreads through the confined spaces of a ship with terrifying efficiency. Scurvy, the sailor's curse that causes teeth to loosen and old wounds to reopen, claims its victims with inexorable patience, though the Dutch are among the first to experiment with methods of prevention. Typhus, dysentery, and various fevers find fertile ground in the crowded, unsanitary conditions below deck, and the ship's surgeon, if one is carried at all, often possesses little more than enthusiasm and a collection of remedies that owe more to superstition than to medical science. The isolation from news of home creates its own particular torment. Letters delivered at the beginning of a voyage become sacred relics, read and reread until they fall apart from handling. News of births, deaths, marriages, and other significant events reaches the sailor months or even years after the fact, creating a strange displacement in time where home exists in a parallel universe, governed by different seasons and different concerns. The Dutch sailor, accustomed to the detailed record-keeping and regular communication that characterizes life in the Republic, finds this information vacuum particularly difficult to endure. Whether the master of all who venture upon the sea, governs every aspect of shipboard life with capricious authority, the gentle trade winds that fill the sails and speed the ship toward its destination can vanish without warning, leaving the vessel becalmed in a glassy sea where the sun beats down mercilessly and the canvas hangs limp and useless. Storms arrive with equal unpredictability, transforming the ship from a comfortable home into a fragile shell, battered by forces beyond human comprehension. During these trials, the careful hierarchies and routines of normal shipboard life give way to a desperate cooperation, where every man's survival depends upon the competence and courage of his shipmates. The constant dampness aboard ship creates its own catalog of miseries. Canvas clothing becomes sodden and remains damp for weeks, causing rashes and infections that resist all attempts at treatment. The wooden surfaces of the ship, no matter how carefully maintained, develop a perpetual slickness that makes every movement treacherous. Personal belongings develop a coating of mold and corrosion that seems to emerge from the very air. And the simple act of keeping one's few possessions dry becomes a daily struggle against the maritime environment. Yet within these harsh realities, the Dutch sailor develops a particular form of resilience that reflects the best qualities of his homeland culture. The same methodical approach that creates successful merchants and skilled craftsmen transforms ordinary men into competent seamen capable of navigating across vast oceans and returning safely home. The Protestant work ethic that drives the Dutch economy finds new expression in the meticulous maintenance of ships and the patient endurance of hardships that would break men from less disciplined societies. Camaraderie forms naturally among men who share such extreme conditions, creating bonds that often last long after the voyage ends. The sailor who shares his ration with a sick shipmate, who takes an extra watch so that an exhausted companion can rest, or who uses his skill to save others during a crisis, earns a form of respect and affection that transcends the usual distinctions of rank and birth. These relationships, forged in the crucible of shared hardship, often prove stronger and more enduring than those formed in the comfortable circumstances of shore life. It is within this context of hardship, confinement, and mutual dependence that the peculiar system of Dutch naval discipline finds its meaning and necessity. The harsh realities of shipboard life create tensions that must be managed, conflicts that must be resolved, and standards that must be maintained if the ship and its crew are to survive their ordeal and return successfully to port. The punishments that seem merely curious or cruel when viewed from the comfort of shore reveal their deeper purpose when understood as tools for maintaining order and morale among men pushed to the very limits of human endurance as the watches change and another day draws to its close aboard our imaginary Dutch vessel. We can observe the subtle rituals that mark the transition from day to night. The evening meal, such as it is, provides a brief respite from labor and an opportunity for the quiet conversations that bind the crew together. Stories are shared, songs are sung in voices roughened by salt air, and the older sailors pass on the wisdom that might mean the difference between life and death when the next crisis arrives. In these moments, the harsh realities of shipboard life are temporarily forgotten, replaced by the gentle fellowship of men who have learned to find dignity and even happiness within the most challenging circumstances imaginable. In the amber light of the ship's great cabin, where brass instruments gleam softly against oak paneling polished by countless hands, the captain sits at his chart table with documents that hold the power of life and death over every soul aboard his vessel. These are not merely rules written on parchment, but codes of conduct carved as deeply into the fabric of maritime life as the ship's name carved into her stern. The gentle creak of timber and the soft whisper of waves against the hull provide a rhythmic backdrop to the serious business of governance that unfolds in this floating realm beyond the reach of earthly courts. The Dutch approach to naval discipline reflects centuries of seafaring wisdom distilled through the careful, methodical nature of their society. Where other nations might rely upon the arbitrary will of commanders or the brutal traditions inherited from military conquest, the Dutch have developed a system that attempts to balance the absolute necessity of obedience with the practical recognition that ships are communities of interdependent souls who must somehow find ways to live and work together in the most challenging circumstances imaginable. The ship's articles, read aloud to the assembled crew before each voyage begins, represent more than a simple list of prohibited behaviors and prescribed punishments. They constitute a social contract that transforms a collection of individual sailors into a functioning society, capable of surviving months or even years beyond the reach of civilization. Each article has been refined through generations of experience, shaped by countless voyages that tested the limits of human cooperation and revealed the fatal consequences of inadequate discipline. The captain's authority, aboard a Dutch vessel, extends far beyond the simple command of navigation and seamanship. He serves as judge, jury, and executive authority in a floating kingdom, where his word carries the force of law, and his decisions can mean the difference between successful completion of the voyage and disaster for all aboard. Yet this authority, awesome in its scope, is tempered by traditions and expectations that constrain arbitrary power and demand that discipline be administered with wisdom, fairness, and careful attention to the maintenance of crew morale. The first mate, that weathered figure who serves as the captain's right hand in all matters of daily operation, carries the responsibility for translating the captain's will into practical action. His knowledge of seamanship, accumulated through years of experience in waters around the globe, makes him the natural intermediary between the lofty authority of command and the practical realities of maintaining discipline among men whose lives depend upon instant obedience to orders that may seem arbitrary or incomprehensible to those not versed in the mysteries of wind and wave. The boatswain, master of the intricate web of ropes and rigging that transforms the ship from a helpless log into a creature capable of harnessing the wind's power, holds particular authority over the daily routines that keep the vessel operational. His ability to organize the complex choreography of sail handling, to identify and correct problems before they become dangerous, and to train newcomers in the subtle arts of seamanship makes him an indispensable figure in the ship's hierarchy. The boatswain's word on matters of rigging and seamanship carries weight second only to that of the captain himself, and his recommendations regarding discipline often influence the form and severity of punishments administered to errant crew members. The concept of collective responsibility permeates Dutch naval discipline in ways that reflect the broader characteristics of their society. Just as Dutch merchants understand that their individual success depends upon the prosperity and reputation of their trading community as a whole, Dutch sailors learn that their personal safety and the success of their voyage depend upon the competence and reliability of every member of the crew. This understanding creates a form of peer pressure that often proves more effective than formal punishment in maintaining standards of behavior and performance. The watch system that governs the rhythm of shipboard life creates its own framework for discipline and accountability. Each watch, typically consisting of half the ship's crew, develops its own internal dynamics and informal hierarchies that supplement the formal structure of command. The experienced sailors who serve as watch leaders carry the responsibility for training newcomers, maintaining efficiency during their assigned hours, and ensuring that their section of the crew meets the standards expected by the officers. This system distributes the burden of maintaining discipline throughout the ship's company, creating multiple layers of oversight and accountability. The morning inspection, conducted with the methodical thoroughness that characterizes all Dutch endeavors, serves both practical and symbolic purposes in maintaining shipboard discipline. As the crew stands at attention, while officers examine the cleanliness of their persons, the condition of their clothing, and the tidiness of their quarters, the ritual reinforces the importance of maintaining standards even under the most challenging circumstances. The sailor who appears for inspection with dirty clothing or unkempt appearance receives not only formal correction but also the disapproval of his messmates. Understand that individual slovenliness reflects upon the reputation of the entire crew. The allocation of duties aboard ship follows principles that balance practical necessity with considerations of fairness and the maintenance of morale. The most dangerous and demanding tasks, such as working aloft during storms or cleaning, the bilges, are distributed among the crew according to systems that take into account experience, physical capability, and previous service. The Dutch understanding that resentment over unfair treatment can poison the atmosphere of cooperation, essential to the ship's success, leads to careful attention to the perceived equity of work assignments and the fair distribution of both privileges. In hardships, the role of religion in maintaining shipboard discipline cannot be overlooked. For the Calvinist principles that shape Dutch society find particular expression in the confined world of the ship. Sunday services conducted by the captain or another officer qualified to lead religious observances provide not only spiritual comfort, but also regular opportunities to reinforce the moral principles that underlie the ship's articles. The reading of scripture, the singing of hymns, and the offering of prayers for safe voyage create moments of shared reflection that remind every soul aboard of their duties to God, country, and shipmates. The ship's log, maintained with the obsessive attention to detail that characterizes Dutch record-keeping, serves as both historical record and instrument of discipline. Every significant event, from changes in weather to infractions of the ship's rules, finds its place in these carefully maintained documents. The knowledge that their actions will be recorded for posterity and potentially reviewed by company officials upon the ship's return influences the behavior of both officers and crew members. The log entries describing disciplinary actions serve not only as legal documentation, but also as a form of permanent shame that follows offenders long after their immediate punishment has ended. The gradation of offenses from minor infractions that merit only verbal correction to serious crimes that threaten the safety of the ship reflects a sophisticated understanding of human nature and the varying degrees of moral culpability that characterize different forms of misconduct. The Dutch Naval Code recognizes distinctions between crimes of passion and premeditated wrongdoing, between offenses born of ignorance and those stemming from willful defiance, between individual failures and conspiracies that threaten the fundamental order of shipboard society. The concept of redemption, central to Protestant theology, finds expression in the structure of Dutch naval punishment. Rather than simply inflicting pain or humiliation as retribution for wrongdoing, the ideal punishment seeks to reform the offender and restore him to useful membership in the ship's community. This approach recognizes the practical reality that permanently alienating a crew member not only wastes human resources, but also creates ongoing problems for maintaining morale and cooperation. The goal is not to break the spirit of the offender, but to redirect his energies toward constructive contribution to the common enterprise. The involvement of the crew in certain forms of disciplinary proceedings reflects the democratic elements that exist within the hierarchical structure of ship governance. While the captain's authority remains absolute in matters of navigation and major discipline, minor infractions may be addressed through processes that involve consultation with senior crew members or even informal trials conducted according to traditional maritime customs. These proceedings serve multiple purposes. They help ensure that punishments are perceived as fair. They provide opportunities for the crew to reinforce their own standards of acceptable behavior. They create a sense of participation in the governance of their floating community. The symbolic dimensions of punishment often prove as important as the physical discomfort or practical inconvenience inflicted upon offenders. The Dutch understanding of shame as a powerful motivator leads to the development of punishments that mark the offender's transgression in ways visible to the entire ship's company. The sailor who must wear distinctive clothing, perform humiliating tasks, or endure public ridicule experiences. It's a form of social isolation that often proves more effective than physical pain in discouraging repetition of the offense. The timing of punishments within the rhythm of shipboard life receives careful consideration from wise commanders who understand that the effectiveness of discipline depends not only upon its severity, but also upon its dramatic impact. Punishments administered before the assembled crew during the change of watch ensure maximum visibility and reinforcement of the lessons they are intended to teach. The choice of location, the formal reading of charges, and the solemn execution of sentence all contribute to the creation of memorable experiences that serve as warnings to potential future offenders. The maintenance of detailed records regarding each crew member's behavior, performance, and disciplinary history allows officers to tailor their approach to individual cases with precision that would be impossible in larger military organizations. The Dutch merchant captain, responsible for the success of his voyage and the welfare of his crew, develops intimate knowledge of each sailor's strengths, weaknesses, and motivations. This personal familiarity enables the application of discipline in ways that account for individual circumstances while maintaining the consistent standards necessary for effective governance. As night falls over our vessel and the watch changes once again, we can observe the subtle ways in which the day's disciplinary lessons are absorbed into the fabric of shipboard life. Conversations in the crew's quarters reflect upon the fairness of punishments witnessed, the wisdom of officers' decisions, and the lessons to be learned from others' mistakes. These informal discussions serve as a final component in the educational process that transforms individual acts of discipline into collective understanding of acceptable behavior and shared commitment to the standards that make survival possible in the vast loneliness of the ocean. The gentle roll of the ship and the eternal rhythm of waves against her hull provide a soothing backdrop to these serious considerations of governance and human nature. In this floating world, where the familiar landmarks of civilization have vanished beyond the horizon, the careful structure of discipline and authority creates the stability and predictability that allow human communities to flourish even under the most challenging circumstances. Tomorrow will bring new tests of this system, new opportunities for both failure and redemption. As the ship continues its journey across waters that recognize no law save those that men impose upon themselves, the flickering light of oil lamps that cast dancing shadows across the rough-hewn beams of the ship's interior we discover a treasury of curious customs that would seem fantastical to those who have never ventured beyond the sight of land. The Dutch, with their characteristic blend of practical efficiency and moral imagination, have developed a catalog of punishments that reads like something from a philosopher's dream or a child's cautionary tale. These are not the brutal floggings or grim executions that mark the discipline of other naval traditions, but rather a collection of corrections that seek to reform through shame, to educate through embarrassment, and to restore order through the careful application of social pressure. The philosophy underlying these unusual punishments reflects the deep currents of Dutch culture, where the Protestant emphasis on personal responsibility meets the merchant's understanding that human resources are too valuable to waste through needless brutality. Each strange ritual of correction has evolved through generations of maritime experience, shaped by the recognition that men confined within the wooden walls of a ship must somehow find ways to live together without destroying the delicate bonds of cooperation that make survival possible. Consider the punishment known as riding the wooden horse, where the offender must straddle a triangular beam rigged high above the deck, his legs dangling in the air while the ship's motion creates a painful sawing motion that tests both physical endurance and personal dignity. This correction, used primarily for sailors caught stealing from their messmates' meager possessions, combines physical discomfort with public humiliation in a way that makes the punishment fit the crime through symbolic representation. The thief, who sought to elevate himself above his fellows through dishonest means, finds himself literally elevated above the crew in a position that offers no comfort or advantage. The practice of kissing the gunner's daughter presents another, an example of Dutch ingenuity in matters of discipline. The sailor who has shown disrespect to his officers or violated the protocols of military courtesy finds himself bent over one of the ship's cannons while receiving a prescribed number of blows from a rope's end. The cannon, nicknamed the gunner's daughter in maritime parlance, serves as both the instrument of restraint and the symbol of the ship's military purpose, reminding the offender that his personal pride must be subordinated to the larger mission that brought them all to sea. Perhaps most peculiar of all is the punishment of dancing the hempen jig, reserved for the most serious offenses that stop short of crimes worthy of death. The condemned sailor is required to perform an elaborate dance while wearing a noose around his neck, the rope's length carefully calculated to allow movement without strangulation. This macabre ballet serves multiple purposes. It provides a vivid reminder of the fate that awaits those who persist in serious wrongdoing. It offers a form of public theater that entertains the crew while delivering its moral lesson. And it gives the offender an opportunity to demonstrate remorse and win back the sympathy of his shipmates through his performance. The Dutch innovation of swabbing the deck with one's beard exemplifies the creative approach to punishment that characterizes their maritime culture. Sailors who have shown laziness in their assigned duties find themselves required to clean the ship's deck using only their facial hair as a scrubbing implement. This punishment, while seemingly absurd, serves practical purposes. It ensures that the offender contributes to the ship's cleanliness even while being corrected. It provides visible evidence of the consequences of shirking duty, and it typically results in the removal of the offender's beard, marking him as someone who has fallen short of proper standards till his whiskers grow back. The practice of running the gauntlet with wooden spoons presents an adaptation of military tradition to the unique circumstances of shipboard life. The sailor who has committed offenses against his messmates must walk between two lines of crew members, each armed with a wooden spoon rather than the traditional rope or stick. The choice of wooden spoons, drawn from the ship's galley, creates a punishment that is both humiliating and relatively harmless. While the domestic nature of the implement serves as a reminder that the ship's company functions as a kind of extended family where certain standards of behavior must be maintained. The curious punishment of wearing the fool's cap demonstrates the Dutch understanding of shame as a powerful corrective force. Sailors who have shown poor judgment or made foolish mistakes that endangered themselves or their shipmates must wear a distinctive pointed cap decorated with bells and ribbons while performing their duties. This visual marking serves not only to identify the offender, but also to create a constant reminder of the consequences of thoughtless action. The bilgewater itself varies in depth and consistency, depending upon the ship's condition, the weather encountered during the voyage, and the efficiency of previous pumping operations. In some cases, the condemned sailor finds himself standing, ankle-deep in liquid that has the consistency of thin soup, surface alive with patterns of oil and debris that create an ever-changing tapestry of corruption. In other instances, particularly aboard older vessels or during rough weather, the bilge water may reach the offender's waist, forcing him to wade through the foul mixture while maintaining his balance against the ship's motion. The duration of bilge water punishment varies according to the severity of the offense and the judgment of the commanding officer. Minor infractions might require only a brief immersion, sufficient to ensure that the offender carries the distinctive aroma of the bilge for several days as a reminder of his transgression. More serious offenses demand longer exposure, during which the condemned sailor must not only endure the physical discomfort of his situation, but also perform useful work by assisting with the manual removal of debris that cannot be cleared through normal pumping operations. The physical effects of prolonged exposure to bilge water provide their own form of correction. Mixture of salt water, organic decay, and various chemicals creates a solution that irritates the skin and produces a burning sensation that intensifies with continued contact. The offender emerges from his ordeal marked by red patches and abraded areas that serve as visible evidence of his punishment, while the penetrating odor that clings to his person ensures that his disgrace cannot be hidden or forgotten until time and repeated washing gradually restore him to acceptable condition. The psychological impact of bilge water punishment often proves more lasting than its physical effects. The condemned sailor must confront the fundamental reality that his actions have reduced him to the level of the ship's waist, that his behavior has been deemed worthy only of association with the accumulated refuse that civilized society seeks to eliminate. This confrontation with the consequences of moral failure creates opportunities for genuine reflection and repentance that more superficial punishments might not provide. The social dimensions of bilge water trials extend far beyond the immediate punishment of individual offenders. The crew members who witness these proceedings receive powerful lessons about the consequences of failing to maintain proper standards, while the communal nature of the punishment creates opportunities for collective reflection on the values and behaviors that distinguish respectable sailors from those who have fallen into disgrace. The shared experience of observing bilge water trials helps to reinforce group solidarity and commitment to the standards that make harmonious shipboard life possible. The Dutch innovation of bilge water baptism represents a variation of this punishment that incorporates religious symbolism into the corrective process. Sailors who have engaged in particularly shameful behavior, such as theft from their messmates or deliberate sabotage of ship's equipment, undergo a ceremony that parodies the Christian sacrament of baptism while emphasizing the possibility of spiritual cleansing through genuine repentance. The offender must kneel in the bilge water, while an officer or senior sailor recites a mock liturgy that emphasizes the themes of death to sin and rebirth to righteousness. The practice of feeding the bilge rats creates another dimension of punishment that involves the condemned sailor and the ongoing maintenance of ship's hygiene. The offender must spend his punishment period not merely enduring the unpleasant environment of the bilge, but actively working to improve it by removing the rats, debris, and other sources of contamination that threaten the health and comfort of the entire crew. This transformation of punishment into useful labor reflects the Dutch preference for corrections that serve practical purposes while delivering moral lessons. The timing of bilge water punishments receives careful consideration from wise commanders, who understand that the effectiveness of such corrections depends partly upon their dramatic impact and partly upon their integration into the ship's operational routine. Punishments administered during calm weather, when the ship's motion is minimal and the bilge water remains relatively stable, allow for more thorough immersion and longer duration. Corrections applied during rough seas, when the bilge water sloshes violently with each wave, create more dramatic and memorable experiences while serving practical purposes by ensuring more complete agitation and mixing of the accumulated fluids. The medical aspects of bilge water Punishment require careful attention from responsible officers, who must balance the corrective value of the experience against the genuine health risks posed by prolonged exposure to contaminated water. Ships' surgeons, when available, often provide guidance regarding the safe duration of bilge water immersion, while experienced officers learn to recognize the signs of excessive exposure that might transform corrective punishment into dangerous torture. The restoration process that follows bilge water punishment represents an essential component of the overall corrective experience. The offender must be thoroughly cleaned and provided with fresh clothing before being readmitted to normal shipboard society, but this cleansing process typically requires several days, during which the lingering effects of punishment serve as continuing reminders of the consequences of improper behavior. The gradual fading of physical marks and odors parallels the offender's gradual restoration to full membership in the ship's community. The documentation of bilge water trials and ship's logs reveals the careful attention that Dutch officers paid to ensuring that such punishments served legitimate corrective purposes rather than mere vindictive cruelty. Log entries typically describe not only the offense that warranted punishment and the duration of bilge water immersion, but also the offender's behavior during punishment and evidence of genuine repentance or reform. These records serve both as legal protection for officers who administered unusual punishments and as historical documentation of the effectiveness of various corrective approaches. The seasonal variations in bilge water composition create different experiences for offenders. Punished at various times during a voyage. Early in a journey, when the bilge water consists primarily of clean seawater mixed with the natural seepage from ship's timbers, the punishment remains relatively mild and tolerable. As the voyage progresses and the bilge water accumulates cargo, residues, food scraps, and other organic matter, the punishment becomes increasingly unpleasant and potentially dangerous, requiring greater caution and shorter duration to avoid serious harm. The relationship between bilge water punishment and the ship's overall discipline system demonstrates the sophisticated understanding of human psychology that characterizes Dutch maritime culture. Officers who employ bilge water trials effectively recognize that such extreme corrections must be reserved for truly serious offenses, lest their shock value be diminished through overuse. The threat of bilge water punishment often proves as effective as its actual application, serving as a powerful deterrent that helps maintain order without requiring frequent resorts to such unpleasant measures. As evening falls and the condemned sailor emerges from his ordeal in the ship's depths, climbing slowly back toward the inhabited areas of the vessel, we can observe the complex emotions that play across the faces of crew members who witness his return. There is relief that the punishment has ended, curiosity about its effects upon the offender's character, and perhaps a renewed appreciation for the standards of behavior that keep them all safely above the level of the bilge. The gentle motion of the ship and the clean salt air that fills the sails seem particularly precious to those who have been reminded of the alternative that awaits those who fail to maintain their place in the community of respectable mariners. Bilge water trials, with all their unpleasant realities and profound symbolism, present one of the most distinctive elements of Dutch maritime justice. They embody the practical recognition that ships are closed systems where waste and corruption cannot simply be discarded, but must be managed and controlled through the collective efforts of the entire crew. In the dark waters that collect in the ship's lowest spaces, offenders discover not only the consequences of their individual failures, but also their connection to the larger enterprise that brought them to sea and their responsibility for maintaining the standards that make survival and success possible in the vast loneliness of the ocean. In the annals of maritime punishment, few practices capture the imagination quite like keel hauling, that most dramatic and terrifying of corrections that transforms the very hull of the ship into an instrument of justice. As our Dutch vessel rocks gently in the swells of a calm sea, with the morning sun casting long shadows across her weathered deck, we can envision the solemn preparations that would precede this most serious of punishments, reserved for offenses so grave that they threaten the very survival of the ship's community. The bells tinkling with every movement ensure that the punishment cannot be forgotten or ignored by anyone. Within earshot, the practice of speaking only in rhyme presents one of the most intellectually demanding punishments in the Dutch maritime repertoire. Sailors who have been caught in lies or who have spread false rumors must conduct all conversation in verse 4, a prescribed period, typically ranging from 1 day to a full week. This correction serves multiple purposes. It forces the offender to think carefully before speaking. It provides entertainment for the crew during the long hours of routine duty. It creates a memorable association between dishonesty and difficulty. That helps prevent repetition of the offense. The punishment known as feeding the seabirds requires the offender to stand at the ship's rail during meal times, holding portions of his own food ration high above his head while gulls and other maritime scavengers swoop down to snatch the offerings. This correction is typically applied to sailors who have wasted food or complained about the quality of their rations. Creates a vivid demonstration of the value of sustenance, while providing a spectacle that reminds the entire crew of their dependence. Upon careful resource management, the Dutch innovation of preaching to the fishes demonstrates their ability to combine religious instruction with corrective discipline. Sailors who have shown disrespect during religious services or who have engaged in blasphemous speech must deliver sermons to the ocean from the ship's bow. Their words carried away by the wind, while dolphins and other sea creatures serve as their congregation. This punishment acknowledges the offender's need for spiritual correction, while creating a form of public penance that often proves more effective than private prap. The practice of wearing women's clothing serves as punishment for sailors who have shown cowardice in the face of danger or who have failed to perform their duties during critical moments. The offender must dress in garments typically worn by women, borrowed from the ship's stores or fashioned from available materials. While continuing to perform his regular duties, this punishment operates on multiple levels. It challenges traditional concepts of masculine honor. It creates visual comedy that helps maintain crew morale. And it provides a powerful incentive for the offender to demonstrate renewed courage. Incompetence. The curious correction known as singing for one's supper requires the offender to provide entertainment for the crew during mealtimes, performing songs, reciting poetry, or telling stories in exchange for his food ration. This punishment typically applied to sailors who have shown antisocial behavior or who have failed to contribute adequately to the ship's community life. Transforms the offender from a burden into a contributor while providing much-needed diversion. During the monotonous hours of ocean travel, the Dutch practice of writing letters to one's mother represents perhaps the most psychologically sophisticated punishment in their arsenal. Sailors who have engaged in behavior that would shame their families must compose detailed letters describing their offenses and the corrections they have received. These letters to be delivered upon the ship's return to port. The punishment operates primarily through anticipation of family disappointment and social disgrace, creating long-term consequences that extend far beyond the immediate correction applied. Aboard ship, the punishment of standing guard over one's own possessions requires the offender to maintain constant vigilance over his sea chest and personal belongings, unable to leave his post for meals, rest, or regular duties until relieved by an officer. This correction typically applied to sailors who have failed to maintain proper care of their equipment or who have been careless with ship's property. Creates a heightened awareness of the value and vulnerability of personal possessions while providing time for reflection on the consequences of negligence. The practice known as befriending the ship's cat requires the offender to serve as constant companion to the vessel's feline mascot, responsible for the animal's feeding, grooming, and entertainment while carrying out regular duties. This punishment is often applied to sailors who have shown cruelty to animals or lack of consideration for other living creatures. Creates opportunities for developing empathy and responsibility while providing practical benefits to the ships. Pest control efforts. The Dutch innovation of becoming the ship's weatherman transforms punishment into education by requiring the offender to study atmospheric conditions and provide daily weather predictions to the crew. Sailors who have shown poor judgment or inability to plan ahead must develop skills in observation and forecasting while taking responsibility for advising their shipmates about changing conditions. This correction turns individual shortcomings into community service while developing practical skills that benefit everyone aboard. The curious punishment of composing songs about one's crimes requires the offender to create musical compositions that detail his offenses and express appropriate remorse. These songs to be performed for the entertainment and education of the entire crew. This correction combines creative expression with public confession, creating memorable lessons that often outlast the voyage itself as successful compositions enter the informal repertoire of maritime folk music. As we survey this remarkable catalog of creative corrections, we begin to understand the sophisticated psychology that underlies Dutch maritime discipline. Each punishment is carefully designed to address not only the immediate offense, but also the underlying character flaws or circumstantial pressures that led to the transgression. The goal is always restoration rather than destruction reform. Rather than revenge, the maintenance of community harmony rather than the satisfaction of abstract justice. The effectiveness of these unusual punishments lies not in their severity, but in their ability to create memorable experiences that reinforce important lessons while maintaining the delicate balance of authority and cooperation that makes shipboard life possible. In the confined world of the ship, where every individual's actions affect the welfare of the entire community, these creative corrections serve as both deterrent and education, helping to shape the character of sailors while preserving the human dignity that makes survival meaningful, even under the most challenging circumstances. In the deepest recesses of the ship, where the curved hull timbers disappear into shadows and the air hangs thick with moisture and mysterious vapors, lies the bilge, that dark realm where all of the ship's troubles eventually collect and fester. Here, in water that has seeped through countless seams and absorbed the essence of every cargo, every spill, and every misfortune that has befallen the vessel, we discover the source of some of the most peculiar punishments in the Dutch maritime repertoire. The bilge water, that foul cocktail of seawater, rainwater, and the accumulated detritus of shipboard life, which becomes both the instrument and the symbol of justice for those who have failed to meet the standards expected of proper sailors. The very nature of bilge water makes it a perfect tool for the Dutch approach to corrective discipline. This liquid, which appears almost black in the dim light of the ship's lower levels, carries within its depths the essence of the vessel's entire history. Traces of exotic spices from previous cargoes mingle with rust from iron fittings, fragments of rope and canvas decompose slowly in its depths, and the natural oils from the ship's timbers create a surface film that catches and reflects the feeble light of lanterns and patterns that seem to shift and writhe with malevolent purpose. The punishment known as taking the bilge cure represents one of the most dreaded corrections available to Dutch naval officers, reserved for sailors whose offenses demonstrate a fundamental disrespect for the cleanliness and order that makes civilized life possible aboard ship. The condemned sailor must descend into the bilge area during the ship's regular pumping operations, not to assist with the necessary work of keeping the vessel afloat, but to immerse himself completely in the foul water that is accumulated in the ship's lowest spaces. The ritual begins at dawn, when the first light filtering through the ship's hatches creates long shadows that seem to point accusingly toward the entrance to the bilge. The offender, having been awakened before the regular watch change, must present himself to the boatswain, wearing only the most basic garments. For any clothing subjected to bilge water becomes permanently stained and permeated with odors that resist all attempts at cleaning. The crew gathers to witness this ceremony, their faces reflecting a mixture of sympathy for their shipmate and relief that they themselves have not fallen to such depths of disgrace. The descent into the bilge represents more than a simple physical journey from the inhabited areas of the ship to its most unpleasant depths. It becomes a symbolic passage from the community of respectable sailors to a temporary exile among the accumulated refuse of maritime life. As the offender lowers himself through the narrow opening that provides access to the bilge, he leaves behind the familiar world of sea breezes, sunlight, and human companionship, entering a realm that seems to exist outside the normal order of shipboard existence. The word keel hauling itself derives from the Dutch keelhaulen, reflecting the origins of this practice in the maritime traditions of the Low Countries, where the flat-bottomed ships and tidal waters of the Zuiderzee provided the perfect conditions for developing this most aquatic of corrections. The punishment involves dragging the condemned sailor beneath the ship's hull from one side to the other, a journey that tests not only physical endurance, but also the fundamental human relationship with the element that both sustains and threatens. All who venture upon the sea, the Dutch, approach to keel hauling differs significantly from the often fatal variations practiced by other maritime nations. Where Spanish or English sailors might face certain death from the razor-sharp barnacles that encrust their ships' hulls after months at sea, Dutch vessels, with their frequent returns to home ports and meticulous maintenance routines, often present less dangerous surfaces for the condemned to traverse. This attention to the condition of their ships reflects the broader Dutch philosophy that punishment should serve corrective rather than destructive purposes, offering the possibility of redemption even for the most serious offenders. The preparation for a keel hauling ceremony begins hours before the actual punishment, as the ship's company makes the complex arrangements necessary to ensure that justice can be administered safely and effectively. The condemned sailor, having been informed of his sentence at dawn, spends the morning hours in contemplation of his fate while the crew prepares the elaborate system of ropes and pulleys that will control his underwater journey. This period of anticipation serves its own corrective purpose, allowing time for reflection and repentance, while building the dramatic tension that makes the eventual punishment so memorable. The selection of crew members to assist with keel hauling reflects the serious nature of the proceeding and the need for absolute reliability in those who hold the condemned sailor's life in their hands. Experienced bosun's mates, chosen for their skill with rope work and their steady temperament under pressure, take charge of the complex rigging required to guide the offender safely beneath the ship's hull. These men understand that their own reputations and perhaps their freedom depend upon the successful completion of their duties. For a keel hauling that results in death through negligence or malice could lead to serious charges against those responsible. The rigging process itself represents one of the most complex applications of seamanship skills to be found anywhere in maritime practice. A heavy rope must be passed completely under the ship's hull, secured at both ends to the deck, and equipped with lighter lines that can be used to control the condemned sailor's passage. The ship's motion must be carefully considered, for waves that seem insignificant to those on deck can create dangerous conditions for someone being dragged through the water below. Wind direction affects not only the ship's position, but also the pattern of currents that flow around her hull, potentially carrying the offender into more dangerous areas or away. From the safety of the guiding ropes, the physical preparation of the condemned sailor reveals the careful attention that Dutch officers paid to balancing punishment with preservation of life. The offender's clothing is removed to prevent entanglement with underwater obstacles, but his body is often coated with tallow or other protective substances that reduce friction and provide some defense against the rough surfaces he will encounter. His hands may be bound to prevent instinctive grabbing that could result in serious injury, while a rope around his waist ensures that he can be quickly retrieved if the punishment goes awry. The moment of commitment, when the condemned sailor is lowered over the ship's side and begins his underwater journey, creates one of the most dramatic spectacles in maritime discipline. The crew lines the rails to witness this ultimate test of courage and endurance, their faces reflecting the complex mixture of emotions that such proceedings inevitably provoke. There is fascination with the sheer audacity of the punishment, sympathy for the suffering of their shipmate, and perhaps relief that they themselves have not fallen to such depths of disgrace. The underwater experience of keel hauling defies easy description, for it combines elements of drowning, abrasion, sensory deprivation into a trial that tests the very limits of human endurance. The condemned sailor, pulled beneath the surface by the weight of his bonds, enters a world of green dimness where the familiar sounds of wind and wave are replaced by the muffled creaking of the ship's timbers and the rushing sound of water past his ears. The pressure of depth, though relatively slight, adds to the sensation of being crushed between the unforgiving elements of water and wood. The physical challenges of the underwater passage vary dramatically depending upon the condition of the ship's hull and the skill of those controlling the ropes above. A well-maintained Dutch vessel, with her hull scraped clean and her copper sheathing intact, might allow relatively safe passage for someone guided by experienced hands. The condemned sailor, in such cases, faces primarily the challenge of holding his breath during the crossing. Though the terror of the experience and the rough handling inevitably inflicted by ropes and current ensure that the punishment remains severe. The timing of the underwater passage reflects both practical considerations and symbolic purposes. The duration must be long enough to create a memorable and corrective experience, but short enough to avoid fatal consequences that would transform punishment into execution. Experienced officers develop an intuitive sense for the proper timing. Reading the bubbles that rise, the peculiar punishments of 18th century Dutch sailors, chapters. 8:15. Complete narration script ****. Chapter 8. Corporal penalties. The sting of the ropes, in Dawes. We drift deeper into the shadowed corners of maritime justice. We find ourselves confronting the most visceral expressions of naval discipline. The elaborate theatrical punishments and symbolic humiliations we've explored were but one face of order at sea. Behind the mock trials and bilgewater ceremonies lay a more immediate, more brutal reality, the direct application of physical force to maintain control over men who live balanced on the knife's edge between civilization and chaos. The ropes end was perhaps the most ubiquitous instrument of correction aboard any Dutch vessel of the 18th century. It's not the formal Cato, nine tails of British naval tradition, but something more immediate, more personal. Picture, if you will, a length of hemp rope, its fibers coarse and unforgiving, wielded by a boatswain whose arms had grown strong from years of hauling sail and anchor. This was not the ceremonial brutality of a formal flogging, but the quick, sharp correction of a master craftsman teaching his trade through pain. The rope's end served as both tool and symbol. It hung from the belt of every petty officer, a reminder as constant as the creaking of the ship's timbers. When Peter Van Houten, a young sailor from Zaandam, was caught sleeping during his watch in the winter of 1743, the correction came swift and immediate. The boatswain's mate, a weathered man named Jan Koopman, whose hands bore the calluses of 20 years at sea, delivered 3 sharp strikes across Van Houten's shoulders. The punishment was over in moments, witnessed by only the handful of men nearby. But its lesson echoed through the watch rotation for weeks afterward. Yet, the Dutch approach to corporal punishment carried with it a peculiar precision that set it apart from the rough justice of other maritime nations. Where British ships might rely on the formal ritual of the Cato, nine tails, administered with military ceremony, Dutch vessels developed a more nuanced system of physical correction. The severity and method of punishment were carefully calibrated to match not just the offense, but the offender's position within the ship's complex social hierarchy. For common seamen, the rope's end sufficed for minor infractions. The punishment was swift, immediate, and designed to sting rather than maim. 3 to 6 strikes were typical, delivered across the shoulders or back, enough to ensure the lesson was learned without compromising the man's ability to work. The Dutch, ever practical, understood that a sailor too injured to perform his duties was of no use to anyone, least of all himself. But as offenses grew more serious, so too did the sophistication of their correction. Theft, that cardinal sin aboard a vessel where every resource was precious and carefully rationed, demanded a more elaborate response. The punishment for pilfering ship's stores was known as running the gauntlet. Though the Dutch interpretation of this ancient military custom carried its own particular flavor, the entire crew would be assembled on deck, ranged in 2 parallel lines stretching from the mainmast to the bow. Each man would be armed with a knotted rope or a length of canvas tied into a crude whip. The condemned sailor, stripped to the waist, would be required to walk slowly between these lines, while each member of the crew delivered a single blow. The journey might take 5 minutes or more, depending on the size of the crew and the deliberate pace demanded by tradition. What made the Dutch version of this punishment particularly insidious was the psychological weight it carried. Unlike other forms of corporal punishment delivered by officers or designated punishers, the gauntlet forced a man's own messmates to participate in his correction. Friendships forged in the cramped quarters below deck were tested as men, who shared their rations and their stories were compelled to raise their hands against their companion. The records of the merchant vessel Vrolijk, sailing between Amsterdam and Batavia in 1751, describe such a punishment in meticulous detail. A sailor named Dirk Vermeer had been caught stealing wine from the officers' stores, a crime that struck at the very heart of the ship's carefully maintained hierarchy. Captain Johannes Brouwer ordered the gauntlet, and the crew assembled with reluctant obedience as Vermeer walked between the lines. Some of his messmates delivered their blows with barely concealed reluctance, soft taps that satisfied the letter of the punishment while preserving some measure of mercy. Others, perhaps eager to demonstrate their own loyalty or nursing private grudges, struck with genuine force. The variation in severity created its own form of torment, as Vermeer could never predict whether the next blow would be a gentle rinder or a genuine assault. The most severe form of corporal punishment in the Dutch maritime arsenal was reserved for crimes that threatened the very survival of the ship and its crew. Mutiny, cowardice in battle, or the deliberate sabotage of essential equipment could result in what the Dutch termed the ultimate correction, a flogging so severe that survival was far from guaranteed. Unlike the relatively informal application of the rope's end or even the communal participation of the gauntlet, these extreme punishments carried with them all the weight of naval law and maritime tradition. The ship's entire company would be assembled, not as participants, but as witnesses to the consequences of betraying the sacred trust that bound them all together in their wooden world. The condemned man would be secured to the mainmast, his arms stretched above his head and bound with rope that had been soaked in seawater to prevent it from cutting too deeply into his flesh. The ship's surgeon would be summoned to monitor the proceedings, not out of mercy, but from practical necessity. A man who died under punishment could tell no tales, could serve as no example, could contribute nothing further to the ship's mission. The instrument of correction for these extreme punishments was not the humble rope's end, but a more elaborate creation. 3 lengths of rope, each as thick as a man's thumb, would be braided together with knots tied at precise intervals. The Dutch called it the teacher, a name that spoke to their belief that even the most severe punishment served an educational purpose. The application of the teacher required skill and experience. Too gentle, and the lesson would be lost on both the victim and the watching crew. Too severe, and the punishment would cross the line from justice into mere brutality. The boatswain charged with this grim duty would count each stroke aloud, his voice carrying across the assembled crew like a litany of consequences. Between each group of 10 strokes, the surgeon would examine the condemned man, checking for signs of unconsciousness or dangerous blood loss. If the man remained conscious and coherent, the punishment would continue. If he showed signs of serious distress, a brief pause would be called, not out of mercy, but to ensure he remained aware of what was happening to him. The records of the Dutch East India Company ship Gelderland, sailing the Indian Ocean in 1758, describe one such extreme punishment in detail that is both fascinating and disturbing. A sailor named Willem de Groot had been caught attempting to scuttle the ship during a storm, apparently driven to desperation by some private torment that the records do not elaborate upon. Captain Peter Vandermeer ordered that de Groot receive 100 strokes of the teacher, a sentence so severe that several members of the crew petitioned for mercy. The captain's response, carefully recorded in the ship's log, reveals much about the Dutch approach to naval discipline. Mercy, he wrote, is a luxury we cannot afford when surrounded by water and dependent upon each other for survival. This man would have drowned us all to ease his own suffering, but his suffering now served to preserve us all. The punishment was carried out over the course of 2 days, with de Groot receiving 50 strokes on each day. the prolonged nature of the correction was designed not just to inflict maximum physical trauma, but to create a spectacle that would resonate in the memories of every man aboard. Between the two sessions, de Groot was kept under guard, his wounds treated with salt water and vinegar to prevent infection, while simultaneously ensuring they remained as painful as possible. Remarkably, de Groot survived his ordeal, though the record suggests he was never quite the same afterward. Completed the voyage to Batavia, where he was discharged from service with a notation in his papers that would ensure he never sailed on another Dutch vessel. His punishment had served its purpose, both as correction and as example. The precision with which these punishments were administered reflected a deeper Dutch philosophy about the nature of discipline itself. Unlike some maritime cultures that viewed punishment as primarily vengeful or cathartic, the Dutch approached corporal correction as a form of education. The pain inflicted was not random or excessive, but carefully calibrated to teach specific lessons about duty, hierarchy, and the consequences of betraying the collective trust. This educational approach extended even to the timing and location of punishments. Minor corrections with the rope's end were often administered immediately after the offense. While the lesson was fresh and the connection between crime and consequence clear, more serious punishments were delayed until the entire crew could be assembled, transforming the correction into a shared learning experience. The Dutch also understood the importance of ritual in making punishment effective. The formal assembly of the crew, the reading of charges, the careful preparation of instruments, and the measured application of correction all served to elevate the punishment above the level of mere violence. It became instead a sacrament of shipboard order, ceremony that reinforced the bonds holding their floating community together. As we consider these harsh realities of life at sea, it's important to remember that they existed within a context of mutual dependence that landlubbers could scarcely imagine. Every man aboard a Dutch vessel in the 18th century knew that his survival depended not just on his own skills and vigilance, but on the competence and loyalty of every other soul aboard. In such circumstances, the failure of any individual could doom them all. The corporal punishments we've examined were brutal by modern standards, but they were also purposeful in ways that purely vengeful violence could never be. They served to maintain the delicate balance of authority and cooperation that kept these wooden worlds functioning in the vast emptiness of the ocean. The sting of the rope's end carried with it not just pain, but the sharp reminder that every man's fate was bound to his brother's, and that betraying that bond carried consequences as immediate as they were severe. As our journey through these maritime customs continues, we'll discover that physical punishment was but one thread in the complex tapestry of beliefs and traditions that governed life aboard Dutch vessels. The pain inflicted by rope and whip was understood to serve purposes that extended far beyond the immediate correction of misbehavior, reaching into the very spiritual foundations upon which Dutch society was built. The salt spray that stung the faces of Dutch sailors in the 18th century carried with it more than just the essence of the sea. It bore the weight of centuries of religious conviction, the accumulated moral certainty of a people who had fought for their faith as fiercely as they had fought for their independence. To understand the peculiar punishments that governed life aboard Dutch vessels, we must first understand the spiritual landscape from which they emerged. A terrain shaped by Calvinist doctrine and the unforgiving certainty of predestination in the bustling ports of Amsterdam, Rotterdam, and Enkhuizen, where the great ships of the Dutch East India Company loaded their cargoes of hope and ambition. The influence of the Reformed Church was as pervasive as the smell of tar and hemp. The same moral framework that governed life in the neat brick houses lining the canals extended its reach across the ocean's vastness, traveling in the hearts and minds of men who carried their faith as surely as they carried their sea chests. Dutch Reformed tradition viewed the world through a lens of moral clarity that left little room for ambiguity. Every action, every choice, every moment of a man's life was understood to reflect his fundamental relationship with divine authority. This perspective naturally extended to the governance of ships, those floating microcosms were the thin veneer of civilization was constantly tested against the raw power of nature and the darker impulses of human nature. Consider the morning routine aboard the merchant vessel Constancia as she made her way through the Indian Ocean in the summer of 1749, before the first watch was set. Before the sails were trimmed to catch the morning breeze, the ship's company would gather on deck for morning prayers. Captain Hendrik van der Laan, a devout man from a family of Amsterdam merchants, would read from the ship's Bible, his voice carrying across the assembled crew, like a beacon of moral certainty in the uncertain world of wind and wave. The prayers themselves were not mere formality, but a daily reaffirmation of the moral order that governed every aspect of shipboard life. The captain's words reminded each man of his place, not just in the ship's hierarchy, but in God's grand design. The sailor, who coiled rope, did so not merely to keep the deck tidy, but to fulfill his divinely appointed role in the great machinery of creation. The officer who maintained discipline did so not from personal preference, but as an agent of divine will. This theological framework provided both justification and limitation for the punishments we have examined. The Dutch Reformed understanding of human nature acknowledged that men were fallen creatures, prone to sin and requiring constant correction to maintain their proper relationship with divine authority. Punishment, therefore, was not seen as cruel but as necessary, not as vengeful but as redemptive. The concept of redemptive suffering, deeply embedded in Calvinist theology, transformed the brutal realities of corporal punishment into something approaching sacred ritual. When a sailor endured the sting of the rope's end or the prolonged agony of the gauntlet, he was understood to be participating in a process of spiritual purification. His physical pain served to burn away the moral corruption that had led to his offense, leaving him cleansed and restored to his proper place in the shipboard community. This religious interpretation of punishment is clearly evident in the detailed records kept by ship's chaplains, those learned men who served as both spiritual guides and moral arbiters aboard the larger vessels of the Dutch fleet. The Journal of Dominee Cornelis Bogaert, who served aboard the East Indiaman Zealandia during her voyage to Ceylon in 1752, provides remarkable insight into how religious conviction shaped the administration of justice at sea. When a young sailor named Joost Verwey was caught gambling with dice during the Sabbath, Dominee Bogaert did not merely record the offense and its punishment. Instead, he crafted an elaborate theological interpretation of the event, seeing in Verwey's transgression a perfect illustration of how the devil sought to corrupt men's souls through seemingly innocent pleasures. The punishment that followed 12 strokes of the rope's end administered after evening prayers was presented not as retribution, but as an opportunity for the young man to demonstrate his repentance through the willing acceptance of correction. The integration of punishment with religious observance created a unique rhythm of moral education aboard Dutch vessels. Sunday services were often preceded by public confessions from those who had transgressed during the previous week. These confessions were not extracted through force, but offered voluntarily, as sailors sought to cleanse their consciences before participating in the sacred ritual of communion. The Confession of Barend Oosterweege, recorded in the log of the ship Rollick in 1750, illustrates the complex interplay between personal guilt and communal forgiveness that characterized Dutch maritime spirituality. Oosterweege had been caught stealing tobacco from a fellow sailor's kit, a relatively minor offense that might have warranted only a few strokes of the rope's end. Instead, he chose to confess his crime publicly during Sunday service, acknowledging not just the theft itself, but the moral weakness that had led to it. "I have sinned against my brother and against God," Oosterweege declared before the assembled crew. "I allowed the weakness of my flesh to overcome the strength of my spirit, and in doing so, I have brought shame upon myself and discord among us all. I accept whatever correction Captain Mulder deems necessary, not as punishment, but as medicine for my diseased soul." The captain's response reveals much about how religious conviction shaped the administration of justice aboard Dutch vessels. Rather than impose additional physical punishment, Captain Mulder required Oosterweege to distribute his own tobacco ration among the crew for the remainder of the voyage. transforming the correction from a moment of pain into an ongoing act of penance and generosity. The Dutch Reformed emphasis on predestination added another layer of complexity to the moral universe of the ship. If God had already determined the fate of every soul before the foundation of the world, what was the purpose of punishment and correction? The answer, as developed by Dutch theologians and adapted by practical-minded ship captains, lay in the understanding that punishment served not to change God's will, but to reveal it. A man who accepted correction with humility and genuine repentance demonstrated the working of divine grace in his heart. A man who rebelled against punishment or showed no signs of moral improvement revealed himself to be among the reprobate, those souls whom God had passed over in his eternal decree. This theological framework allowed ship's officers to view their disciplinary duties not as acts of personal authority, but as participation in God's ongoing work of separating the wheat from the chaff. The practical application of this doctrine can be seen in the extended records of the ship Jalouf, which made 3 voyages to the East Indies between 1755 and 1763 under the command of Captain Willem de Vries, a man whose religious convictions were matched only by his meticulous attention to detail. De Vries maintained not just the standard ship's log, but an additional record he called his Book of Souls, in which he tracked the moral development of every man under his command. In this remarkable document, we can trace the career of a sailor named Klaas van Hoorn, who joined the Jalouf as a young man of 17 and served aboard her for all 3 voyages. Van Hoorn's early years were marked by frequent minor infractions, sleeping on watch, neglecting his duties, showing disrespect to his superiors. Each offense was met with appropriate correction, and De Vries carefully noted not just the punishment administered, but Van Hoorn's response to it. Initially, Van Hoorn showed little improvement. He accepted his punishments with sullen resignation, displaying neither genuine repentance nor meaningful reform. In his Book of Souls, De Vries noted with growing concern that the young man seemed hardened against correction, showing no signs of divine grace working in his heart. The turning point came during the second voyage, when Van Hoorn witnessed the death of his closest friend, swept overboard during a storm off the Cape of Good Hope. The tragedy seemed to awaken something in the young sailor's spirit. Began attending voluntary prayer meetings, sought counsel from the ship's chaplain, and gradually transformed his behavior aboard ship. By the third voyage, Van Hoorn had become one of De Vries's most trusted petty officers, a man whose own experience of correction had given him particular skill in guiding younger sailors through their own moral struggles. In his final entry about Van Hoorn, De Vries wrote, "The Lord's work in this man's heart has been slow but sure. What began as mere punishment has become true discipline, and what started as rebellion has flowered into genuine faith." The Dutch approach to maritime punishment was also shaped by their particular understanding of community and collective responsibility. Unlike the more individualistic approach of some Protestant traditions, Dutch Reformed theology emphasized the interconnectedness of all believers within the body of Christ. This communal perspective naturally extended to life aboard ship, where the actions of any individual could affect the welfare of all. When serious moral infractions occurred, they were often addressed through communal rituals that involved the entire crew in the process of correction and restoration. The punishment of repeat offenders in particular was understood as a community responsibility, rather than merely a matter between the offender and the ship's officers. The case of Peter Voss, recorded in multiple ship's logs from the 1740s, illustrates how this principle operated in practice. Voss was a chronic troublemaker, a man whose constant complaints and deliberate disobedience had made him unwelcome aboard several vessels. When he was assigned to the merchant ship Hoop in 1747, Captain Jan Bakker faced the challenge of dealing with a sailor whose reputation preceded him. Rather than simply impose harsh punishment at the first sign of trouble, Bakker implemented what he called brotherly correction, a system that required every member of Voss's watch to take personal responsibility for his behavior. When Voss showed signs of his old patterns, his watchmates were required to counsel him privately before any formal disciplinary action was taken. Only if this personal intervention failed would the matter be brought to the officer's attention. System worked remarkably well. Voss, perhaps surprised to find himself the object of genuine concern rather than mere authority. Gradually began to respond to the personal investment his fellow sailors were making in his moral development. By the end of the voyage, he had become a model crew member, and his transformation became a powerful example of how Christian love could succeed where mere punishment had failed. The integration of punishment with religious observance also served practical purposes that extended beyond moral education. The regular rhythm of prayer, confession, and correction created a structure that helped maintain morale and discipline during the long, monotonous stretches of ocean travel. The knowledge that transgressions would be addressed through a system that combined justice with mercy provided sailors with a sense of security and predictability that was often lacking in other aspects of their dangerous profession. As we prepare to delve into the personal accounts and detailed records that bring these maritime customs to life, it's important to understand that the religious framework we've examined was not merely decorative, but fundamental to how Dutch sailors understood their world. The harsh punishments we've explored were not arbitrary expressions of authority, but carefully considered applications of moral principles that had been tested in the fires of religious persecution and national struggle. The faith that had sustained the Dutch through their long war of independence against Catholic Spain continued to sustain them in their struggle against the even more implacable forces of wind and wave. In the pages of ships' journals and personal accounts, we'll discover how this religious conviction played out in the daily lives of men who carried their beliefs to the farthest reaches of the known world. The yellowed pages of maritime journals hold within their careful script the authentic voices of men who lived these extraordinary experiences. Unlike the formal records of admiralty courts or the sanitized accounts written for public consumption, these personal testimonies reveal the human reality behind the systematic punishments we have examined. Here, in the privacy of captains' cabins and the cramped quarters below deck, men recorded their true thoughts about the harsh necessities of life at sea. The journal of Captain Mitchell van Brederode, master of the merchant vessel Amsterdam Packet, provides one of the most detailed and emotionally honest accounts of maritime punishment from the period. Van Brederode was not a professional naval officer, but a practical merchant captain, more concerned with profitable voyages than military glory. His recordings, therefore, carry a weight of authenticity that more formal accounts often lack. In the spring of 1744, Van Brederode's ship was 3 weeks out from Texel, bound for the spice ports of the East Indies, when an incident occurred that would test every principle of shipboard discipline he had learned in 20 years at sea. The trouble began, as it so often did, with the discovery of theft. Stores of ship's biscuit had been disappearing from the forward hold, and careful investigation revealed that someone had been systematically pilfering the crew's basic rations. The discovery of theft aboard ship was always serious, but this particular crime struck at the very foundation of maritime survival. Ship's biscuit was carefully calculated to last the entire voyage, with only minimal reserves for unexpected delays. The theft of even small quantities could mean the difference between life and death for every soul aboard if contrary winds or other misfortunes extended their time at sea. Van Brederode's journal entry 4, May 15, 1744, captures his anguish as he contemplated the necessary response. "I have discovered the identity of our thief, and my heart is heavy with the burden of what must follow." Young Cornelis Dekker, barely 18 years old and on his first voyage beyond European waters, has been taking extra rations to supplement what he perceives as insufficient food. The boy comes from a prosperous family in Hoorn and has never known true hunger. He cannot comprehend that his comfort purchased with stolen bread might cost his shipmates their lives. The captain's dilemma was complicated by personal factors that his journal reveals with painful honesty. Dekker's father was Van Brederode's business partner in several trading ventures, and the young man had been entrusted to the captain's care by a family that expected their son to learn seamanship under safe and benevolent guidance. The stark reality of maritime law, however, left no room for such personal considerations. "I am torn between my duty to the ship and my obligation to the boy's family," Van Brederode wrote. "Yet I know that any mercy shown to one who steals the bread from Ed. His companions' mouths will be seen as weakness by the crew, and weakness in a captain can doom us all. The boy must face the consequences of his actions, regardless of who his father might be. The punishment Van Brederode chose was both traditional and carefully calculated to serve multiple purposes. Dekker would face the gauntlet, running between two lines of his shipmates, while each delivered a blow with knotted rope. But the captain added a refinement that spoke to his understanding of both justice and mercy. Before the punishment began, Dekker would be required to address the entire crew, explaining his actions and acknowledging the harm he had done to their collective welfare. The young man's speech, as recorded by Van Brederode, reveals the profound impact such experiences could have on those who underwent them. I have acted with the selfishness of a child, taking what belonged to all of us because I could not bear the discomfort of genuine hunger. I see now that my weakness might have cost you all far more than I took, for it could have meant starvation for some when our supplies ran low. I accept this punishment not because I am compelled to do so, but because I understand that my actions threaten not just your bodies, but the trust that binds us together in this wooden world. The gauntlet that followed was administered with unusual care, and Brederode had privately instructed his most trusted petty officers to ensure that the blows delivered were firm enough to teach their lesson, but not so severe as to cause lasting harm. The captain understood that Dekker's education in maritime reality needed to be thorough, but not destructive. The aftermath of the punishment reveals the complex dynamics that such corrections could create within a ship's company. Several of Dekker's messmates, particularly those closest to his own age, initially showed resentment at what they perceived as lenient treatment. They had expected more severe consequences for such a serious offense, and the careful moderation of the gauntlet seemed to suggest that wealth and family connections could indeed purchase mercy at sea. This tension came to a head several days later when another young sailor, Willem Groot, deliberately provoked a confrontation with Dekker during the evening meal. Groot, who came from a poor family and had known genuine hunger before going to sea, accused Dekker of receiving special treatment because of his father's wealth and influence. Van Brederode's handling of this secondary crisis demonstrates the delicate balance required to maintain harmony aboard ship after punishment had been administered, rather than simply punish Groot for his insubordination. The captain chose to address the underlying sense of injustice that had motivated the confrontation. He called both young men to his cabin and required them to work together on a series of increasingly difficult tasks until they had developed mutual respect and understanding. The journal entries documenting this process reveal Van Brederode's sophisticated understanding of human nature and group dynamics. I have learned that punishment alone cannot heal the wounds that crime creates within our small community, he wrote. Groot's anger was justified, even if his expression of it was inappropriate. Young Dekker needed to prove himself worthy of his shipmates' forgiveness through deeds, not merely through the acceptance of correction. The resolution came when the ship encountered a severe storm off the coast of Africa. During the height of the tempest, Dekker risked his own safety to help secure a loose cannon that threatened to break free and crush several sailors, including Groot. His courage in that moment did more to restore his standing among the crew than any formal punishment could have accomplished. A very different perspective on maritime punishment emerges from the personal journal of Sergeant Paulus Vanderberg, a soldier assigned to the Dutch East India Company ship Batavia during her voyage to Java in 1751. Vanderberg was not a sailor, but a professional military man, and his observations of naval discipline provide valuable insights from someone outside the maritime community. Vanderberg's military background gave him a different perspective on the punishments he witnessed aboard ship. He was accustomed to the formal, ritualized discipline of army life, where infractions were addressed through clearly defined procedures and standardized penalties. The more fluid personal approach to correction he encountered at sea initially struck him as haphazard and potentially dangerous. His journal entry from July 3, 1751, captures his early bewilderment. The sailors aboard this vessel seemed to live according to customs that are foreign to any proper understanding of military discipline. Yesterday, I witnessed a man receive 6 strokes of the rope's end for sleeping during his watch, while another who showed disrespect to an officer was merely required to scrub the deck for an extra hour. In my experience, consistent application of fixed penalties is essential to maintaining proper order. Vanderberg's perspective began to change as he observed the complex social dynamics that govern shipboard life. Unlike the Army, where soldiers could be easily replaced and units reshuffled to maintain effectiveness, a ship's crew had to function as a stable, interdependent community for months or even years at a time. The personal relationships, individual characteristics, and specific circumstances that naval officers took into account when administering punishment served purposes that purely mechanical discipline could not achieve. The sergeant's education in maritime customs reached its climax when he witnessed the punishment of a sailor named Dirk Veldman, who had been caught attempting to steal wine from the officer's private stores. The offense was serious enough to warrant formal charges and a severe penalty. But the circumstances surrounding it revealed layers of complexity that would have been irrelevant in a military context. Veldman is a skilled navigator whose expertise was crucial to the ship's safe passage through the dangerous waters around the Cape of Good Hope. He was also a man whose wife had recently died in childbirth, leaving him to provide for 3 young children who were staying with relatives in Amsterdam while he was at sea. The wine he had attempted to steal was intended not for his own consumption, but as a trade good he'd hoped to sell privately when they reached port. Using the proceeds to send money home to his struggling family, Captain Johannes de Witt faced the challenge of punishing a serious crime committed by an indispensable crew member for understandable, inexcusable reasons. His solution demonstrated the sophisticated moral reasoning that characterized the best of Dutch maritime leadership. Veldman would receive the standard punishment for theft 30 strokes of the Cato, 9 taels, but the penalty would be administered in 3 installments over the course of a week, allowing him to recover between sessions and continue performing his essential duties. Additionally, de Witt arranged for a collection to be taken among the ship's officers and passengers, to provide Veldman with the money he had hoped to earn through his attempted theft. This gesture transformed the punishment from a simple matter of retribution into a complex lesson about the proper balance between personal need and communal responsibility. Vanderberg's account of watching Veldman accept his punishment reveals how even an outsider could be moved by the dignity and purpose that characterized Dutch naval justice at its best. I have seen many men flogged in my military career, but never have I witnessed such a combination of justice and mercy as was displayed today. Veldman accepted his correction without complaint, understanding that his circumstances, however tragic, could not excuse his breach of trust. Yet the captain's arrangement for his family's welfare demonstrated that punishment need not preclude compassion. The most haunting accounts in Vanderberg's journal deal with the rare cases where punishment failed to achieve its intended purpose. The story of Abraham Koster, a chronic troublemaker whose repeated offenses eventually exhausted the patience of even the most tolerant officers, illustrates the tragic limitations of corrective discipline when applied to fundamentally damaged individuals. Koster had been at sea for 15 years, serving aboard vessels of every description from small coastal traders to the great East Indiamen. His record was marked by a consistent pattern of minor infractions, insubordination, and general troublemaking that had made him unwelcome aboard most ships. Captain de Witt had agreed to take him on only because experienced sailors were in short supply, and even then, with considerable reluctance. The pattern of offense and punishment that developed around Koster reveals how the Dutch system of maritime justice could become trapped in cycles of escalating severity when dealing with individuals who seemed incapable of learning from correction. Each punishment Koster received was slightly more severe than the last. His officers attempted to find the level of correction that would finally break through his apparent indifference to consequences. Vanderberg's journal traces this escalation. With growing concern, today Koster received 15 strokes of the rope's end for deliberate negligence in his duties. 2 weeks ago, he received 10 strokes for the same offense. A month before that, it was 6 strokes. Captain DeWitt is caught in an impossible situation. He cannot allow Coster's behavior to corrupt the discipline of the other men. Yet each increase in punishment seems only to harden the man's heart against authority. The crisis came when Coster was discovered attempting to organize what could only be described as a work slowdown among his messmates. Rather than open mutiny, which would have carried extreme penalties, he was encouraging a pattern of subtle resistance, deliberate clumsiness, selective hearing when orders were given, and the kind of passive defiance that could undermine a ship's efficiency without providing clear grounds for severe punishment. Captain DeWitt's response demonstrates both the flexibility and the ultimate limitations of the Dutch approach to naval discipline. Rather than escalate to even more severe physical punishment, he chose to isolate Coster from the rest of the crew, confining him to the ship's brig and requiring him to perform his duties under constant supervision. The message was clear. A man who could not be trusted to participate in the ship's community would be excluded from it. The isolation broke Coster's spirit in ways that no amount of physical punishment had managed to achieve. Within a week, he was begging to be restored to his former position, promising reform and offering to accept whatever additional punishment the captain deemed appropriate. DeWitt's response, as recorded in Vanderberg's journal, reveals the captain's deep understanding of human nature. I told Coster that his words meant nothing to me now. If he truly wished to rejoin our community, he must prove himself through actions, not promises. He would remain in isolation until his behavior demonstrated genuine change. The remainder of the voyage saw Costa gradually earn his way back into the ship's good graces through consistent good behavior and willing service. Vanderberg's final entry about the man suggests that the experience had indeed introduced genuine transformation. Coster's reformation has been remarkable to witness. The man who once seemed incorrigible has become one of our most reliable hands. I begin to understand that the true purpose of punishment at sea is not to inflict suffering, but to restore men to their proper place within the community of the ship. These personal accounts reveal that behind the formal systems of maritime punishment lay a complex web of human relationships, individual circumstances, and moral considerations that no simple code of laws could fully address. The officers who administered these corrections were not sadistic tyrants, but men struggling to maintain order and justice in circumstances that tested every assumption about human nature and social organization. As we prepare to examine how Dutch maritime customs compared with those of other nations, these personal testimonies remind us that the true measure of any system of justice lies not in its formal procedures, but in its capacity to preserve both order and humanity in the face of extraordinary challenges. The voices from these ships' journals speak across the centuries to remind us that even in the harshest circumstances, the possibility of redemption and the power of forgiveness remains central to the Dutch understanding of what it meant to live together in their wooden worlds upon the sea. The wooden ships that crisscrossed the world's oceans in the 18th century carried with them not just the goods and ambitions of their respective nations, but entire systems of law, order, and cultural understanding. To fully appreciate the peculiar character of Dutch maritime punishment, we must set it against the broader tapestry of naval discipline that prevailed across the maritime world. Like different dialects of the same harsh language, each nation's approach to maintaining order at sea reflected its particular history, values, and understanding of human nature. The British Royal Navy, that great floating expression of English, power and ambition, approached maritime discipline with the mechanical precision that characterized so much of British institutional life. Where Dutch captains might consider individual circumstances and personal relationships when administering punishment, British naval regulations prescribed exact penalties for specific offenses, creating a system that prized consistency over flexibility. The infamous British practice of flogging with the Cato Ninetails had been refined into a precise ritual that left little room for personal interpretation. A sailor convicted of theft would receive a specific number of lashes, determined not by his captain's judgment of his character or circumstances, but by the rigid prescriptions of the Articles of War. This systematic approach reflected the British genius for administration and their deep faith in the power of consistent application of rules to maintain order across their vast empire. Captain Horatio Blackwood of HMS Invincible, writing in his private journal during the 7 Years' War, provides insight into the British mindset. The beauty of our system lies in its predictability. Every man aboard knows precisely what fate awaits him should he transgress, and this knowledge serves as the most effective deterrent. Unlike the Dutch, with their endless consultations and considerations of circumstance, we achieve obedience through the simple clarity of cause and effect. Yet this very systematization created problems that Dutch flexibility helped to avoid. The British insistence on uniform punishment meant that a desperate father stealing bread to trade for money to send home to his starving children received the same penalty as a malicious troublemaker who stole for sport. The human complexities that Dutch captains navigated with careful attention to individual circumstances were flattened into administrative categories in the British system. The contrast becomes particularly striking when we examine how the two navies dealt with repeat offenders. British regulations called for escalating punishments with each subsequent offense, eventually leading to the death penalty for persistent criminals. Dutch practice, as we have seen, tended toward isolation and rehabilitation. With execution reserved for crimes that directly threatened the survival of the ship, the Spanish approach to naval discipline reflected the particular cultural mixture of Catholic mysticism and imperial authority that characterized their maritime empire. Spanish ships carried not just weapons and cargo, but elaborate religious artifacts, and the constant presence of priests who served as both spiritual guides and moral arbiters. Punishment aboard Spanish vessels was understood not merely as correction of misbehavior, but as a form of penance that could contribute to the salvation of the offender's soul. The journal of Padre Miguel Hernandez, who served aboard the Spanish treasure ship San Jose during her fateful voyage from Cartagena to Cadiz in 1708, provides remarkable insight into this religiously infused approach to maritime justice. When a sailor named Carlos Mendoza was caught gambling during Holy Week, the punishment prescribed was not merely physical, but intensely spiritual. Mendoza was required to spend 3 days in the ship's makeshift chapel, fasting and praying while the rest of the crew went about their duties. His meals during this period consisted only of bread and water, served at the altar while he knelt in prayer. The physical discomfort was minimal compared to what Dutch or British punishment might have inflicted, but the spiritual humiliation was profound. The purpose of correction, Padre Hernandez wrote, is not to break a man's body, but to humble his spirit before God. Mendoza's gambling was not merely a violation of ship's discipline, but a sin against divine law. His punishment must therefore address the state of his soul as well as his behavior. This Spanish integration of religious penance with maritime discipline created a unique atmosphere aboard their vessels. Sailors understood that their transgressions were not merely matters of practical concern, but eternal questions that would affect their standing before God. The result was often a more profound sense of guilt and repentance than purely physical. Punishment could achieve, but also a tendency toward the kind of superstitious fatalism that could paralyze decisive action in moments of crisis. The Portuguese, inheritors of the world's first global maritime empire, had developed their own distinctive approach to naval discipline during their centuries of oceanic exploration. Portuguese punishment emphasized public humiliation and social degradation rather than physical pain, reflecting their sophisticated understanding of the communal nature of life. Aboard ship, a sailor guilty of cowardice might be required to wear women's clothing for a week, serving as a constant reminder to himself and his shipmates of his failure to meet masculine ideals of courage. Theft might be punished by requiring the offender to eat his meals alone, separated from the communal bonds that made life at sea bearable. These punishments attacked the social identity of the transgressor in ways that could be more devastating than physical pain. The memoir of João de Silva, a Portuguese navigator who served aboard vessels trading between Lisbon and Goa in the 1750s, describes the effects of such social punishments with remarkable insight. I have seen men weep at being excluded from their messmates' conversations, who bore physical beatings without a tear. The pain of the body heals quickly at sea, but the wounds to a man standing among his companions can fester for months. The French approach to maritime discipline reflected the particular character of a nation caught between aristocratic tradition and revolutionary change. French naval officers, many of whom came from noble families, brought to their ships a complex understanding of honor and hierarchy that influenced every aspect of punishment and correction. French ships maintained elaborate distinctions between different classes of offenders that went far beyond the simple officer-sailor divide common to other navies. A gentleman volunteer who committed the same offense as a common seaman would face very different consequences. It's not because French justice was corrupt, because it recognized that different social positions carried different obligations and different vulnerabilities. The Comte de Bougainville, writing about his experiences as a naval officer in the 1760s, explains this apparent inequality with typical French sophistication. A gentleman who steals has fallen farther than a peasant who commits the same crime, for he has betrayed not merely the rules of the ship, but the honor of his birth. His punishment must therefore address not just the immediate offense, but the deeper failure of character it represents. This French emphasis on honor created a system where dueling between officers was not merely tolerated but actively encouraged, as a means of resolving disputes that might otherwise undermine ship's discipline. Where Dutch, British, or Spanish vessels would handle conflicts through formal disciplinary procedures, French ships provided ritualized opportunities for men to defend their reputations through combat. The Russian approach to naval discipline, developed during Peter the Great's dramatic transformation of his nation into a maritime power, combined elements borrowed from other European traditions with distinctly Slavic concepts of authority and submission. Russian ships were floating expressions of the same autocratic principles that governed the vast empire they served, with captains wielding power that would have seemed excessive, even by the standards of other authoritarian naval traditions. Russian punishment emphasized the absolute submission of the individual to state authority in ways that other nations found excessive. A Russian sailor who showed disrespect to an officer might be sentenced, not just to flogging, but to a ritual degradation ceremony, in which he was required to prostrate himself before the entire crew while proclaiming his unworthiness and begging forgiveness. Admiral Fyodor Ushakov, writing about his experiences commanding the Russian Black Sea Fleet in the 1780s, reveals the philosophical assumptions underlying this extreme approach. The sailor who serves the Tsar must understand that he has no existence apart from that service. His individual desires, his personal dignity, his very sense of self must be subordinated to the greater glory of Russia. Only through such complete submission can the chaos of human nature be transformed into the ordered strength that victory requires. Yet this extreme authoritarianism was balanced by a paternalistic concern for the welfare of subordinates that created its own form of maritime community. Russian captains were expected to take personal responsibility for the physical and spiritual welfare of their men in ways that went far beyond the duties of command in other navies. A captain who allowed his men to suffer from preventable disease or inadequate food was seen as failing in his fundamental obligation to the Tsar who had entrusted these souls to his care. The comparison becomes particularly interesting when we examine how different national approaches handled the most serious maritime crimes. Mutiny, the ultimate challenge to shipboard authority, reveals the deepest cultural assumptions about the nature of order and rebellion. The British response to mutiny was swift and terrible, reflecting their understanding of rebellion as an existential threat to the entire system of imperial control. The mutinous sailor faced not just death, but a carefully orchestrated ritual of degradation designed to serve as an example to others. He would be hanged from the yardarm in full view of the assembled fleet, his body left swinging as a reminder of the consequences of challenging established authority. The Dutch approach to mutiny was more complex, reflecting their republican traditions and their sophisticated understanding of the difference between legitimate grievance and treasonous rebellion. A Dutch captain faced with mutinous behavior would often convene a form of shipboard court, allowing the rebels to present their complaints and justify their actions. If their grievances were found to be legitimate, reforms might be instituted, even as the leaders faced punishment for their methods of protest. Spanish. The treatment of mutiny was filtered through their complex understanding of honor and religious duty. A mutinous sailor was seen as having violated not just his obligations to his captain and king, but his sacred oath before God. The punishment therefore took on aspects of religious ritual, with a condemned man given extensive opportunities for confession and absolution before his execution. French responses to mutiny reflected their aristocratic concepts of honor and betrayal. A mutinous sailor had not merely broken regulations, but had dishonored himself and his ship. The punishment therefore emphasized the restoration of honor. Through the mutineer's acceptance of death as the appropriate consequence of his betrayal, these national differences in approach to maritime discipline reflected deeper cultural assumptions about the nature of authority, the purpose of punishment, and the relationship between individual and community. The Dutch emphasis on rehabilitation and reintegration reflected their republican values and their practical understanding that ships succeeded through cooperation rather than mere obedience. The British focus on systematic consistency reflected their administrative genius and their faith in the power of clear rules to govern complex organizations. The Spanish integration of religious penance reflected their Catholic worldview and their understanding of earthly service as preparation for eternal judgment. Yet, despite these significant differences in approach and philosophy, certain underlying realities shaped maritime discipline across all these traditions. The fundamental challenge of maintaining order among men isolated from normal social constraints, dependent on each other for survival and facing constant danger, created similar responses regardless of national culture. The forms might vary, but the essential functions of punishment deterrence, education, restoration of order, and maintenance of morale remained constant across the maritime world. As we prepare to examine the psychological impact of these various systems of punishment, it's worth noting that sailors themselves often served aboard vessels of different nations during their careers, carrying with them comparative knowledge of different approaches to discipline. Their perspectives, shaped by direct experience of various systems, provide invaluable insights into the human reality behind these institutional differences. The Dutch system, viewed through this comparative lens, emerges as neither the most humane nor the most severe, but perhaps the most thoughtful in its attention to the complex human dynamics that determined whether punishment achieved its intended purposes. In the end, the measure of any system of maritime justice lay not in its formal procedures, but in its success at maintaining both order and humanity in the extraordinary circumstances of life at sea. Chapter 12. The psychological impact. On sailors beneath the weathered planks of 18th-century Dutch vessels, in the cramped quarters where sailors sought rest between watches, the true impact of maritime punishment played out in the hidden theaters of the human mind. The physical pain of ropes, end or cat o' nine tails, might fade within days, but the psychological consequences of shipboard discipline shaped men's characters, relationships, and understanding of themselves in ways that could last a lifetime too. Comprehend these deeper effects, we must first understand the unique psychological environment of life at sea. Modern minds, accustomed to privacy, personal space, and the freedom to escape uncomfortable social situations, can barely imagine the intensity of communal life aboard an 18th-century sailing vessel. Every moment of a sailor's existence was spent in the constant presence of his shipmates, every action observed, every word heard, every personal failing exposed to communal scrutiny. The diary of Hendrik Molinier, a young man from Leiden, who served aboard the Dutch East India Company's ship during her voyage to Java in 1746, provides remarkable insight into this psychological landscape. Molinier came from an educated family. His father was a cloth merchant with interests in the textile trade, and his literate observations offer a window into the mental world of maritime punishment that less educated accounts cannot provide. There is no privacy aboard this floating world, Molinier wrote during his second week at sea. A man cannot even relieve himself without his actions being noted by his messmates. Every gesture, every expression, every moment of weakness or strength becomes part of the collective memory of the ship. In such circumstances, punishment becomes not merely a personal experience, but a public drama in which every man aboard plays. Both actor and audience. His total lack of privacy fundamentally altered the psychological impact of punishment. On land, a man who suffered correction might retreat to his home, his family, his private spaces to recover both physically and emotionally. At sea, recovery had to occur under the constant observation of the same men who had witnessed his punishment, creating a complex dynamic of shame, defiance, acceptance, and gradual reintegration that played out over weeks or months. The case of Joris van Amstel, as recorded in Molineux's diary, illustrates how this public nature of maritime punishment could amplify its psychological effects far beyond what the physical severity alone might suggest. Van Amstel, a sailor in his 30s with a wife and children in Amsterdam, was caught stealing wine from the officers' stores. His punishment, 20 strokes of the rope's end. Administered before the assembled crew, was relatively moderate by the standards of maritime justice. The physical effects of Van Amstel's punishment were minimal. Within a few days, the welts on his back had faded, and he was performing his duties with his usual competence. But the psychological aftermath proved far more complex and enduring. Van Amstel had been caught in an act that violated not just ship's regulations but his own sense of himself as an honorable man. The public nature of his correction meant that his shame was shared by every soul aboard, transforming a personal failure into a communal experience. Molineux's observations revealed the subtle ways in which this shared shame affected the entire ship's community. Van Amstel's punishment has created ripples that extend far beyond the man himself. His messmates, who must live and work beside him every day, struggle with their own responses to his disgrace. Some show excessive kindness, as if trying to restore his dignity through their own actions. Others maintain a careful distance, perhaps, fearing that association with him might somehow taint their own reputations. Still others seem almost relieved to have witnessed another man's fall from grace, as if his punishment somehow ensures them against their own potential failures. The psychological mechanisms that sailors develop to cope with the constant threat of punishment reveal much about human adaptability under extreme conditions. Some men, particularly those who had served at sea for many years, developed what might be recognized today as emotional numbing, a deliberate shutting down of empathy and emotional responsiveness that protected them from the psychological impact of witnessing repeated acts of violence and humiliation. Klaus Petersen, an experienced bosun's mate aboard the Vriendschap, exemplified this psychological adaptation. Molineux describes him as a man who could watch the most severe punishments with apparent indifference, showing neither pleasure nor distress at the suffering of his fellow sailors. Yet private conversations revealed that this emotional detachment came at a significant cost. Petersen confided to me that he sometimes feels as though he is watching his own life from a great distance, Molineux wrote. Moved him love for his family, joy and simple pleasures, even grief at loss now seem muted and remote. He fears that the hardness necessary for survival at sea has made him incapable of the tenderness required for life ashore. Developed different psychological defenses. Some threw themselves into religious observance, finding in prayer and scripture a refuge from the brutal realities of maritime discipline. The ship's prayer meetings became gatherings where men could explore their responses to punishment and violence within a framework that promised ultimate justice and redemption. Jan Vos, a young sailor on his first voyage, represents this religious response to the psychological challenges of life at sea. Following Van Amstel's punishment, Vos began attending every voluntary prayer service, spending his off-duty hours reading the ship's Bible, seeking counsel from the chaplain about the proper Christian response to witnessing suffering. Vos struggles with the apparent contradiction between Christian mercy and maritime necessity, Molineux observed. He understands intellectually that discipline is required to maintain order aboard ship, but his heart rebels against the deliberate infliction of pain on fellow human beings. The chaplain counsels him that earthly authorities serve divine purposes, but I see that Vos remains troubled by questions that have no easy answers. The formation of what modern psychology might recognize as trauma bonds, intense emotional connections forged through shared experiences of suffering, was another common psychological response to the harsh realities of maritime punishment. Men who witnessed or endured severe discipline often developed unusually close relationships with their fellow sufferers, creating support networks that could sustain them through the long months at sea. The friendship that developed between Van Amstel and Willem de Groot, another sailor who had been severely punished earlier in the voyage, exemplifies this phenomenon. The two men, who had barely spoken before their respective punishments, became inseparable companions, sharing their rations, standing each other's watches when illness struck, and providing emotional support that helped both men recover their sense of dignity and purpose. Molinier's analysis of this relationship reveals sophisticated insight into the psychological dynamics at work. Van Amstel and de Groot have found in each other something that the rest of us cannot provide: complete understanding without judgment. Each man knows that the other has experienced the particular shame and pain of public punishment, and this shared knowledge creates a bond that transcends ordinary friendship. They speak to each other in ways they cannot speak to those of us who have not shared their experience. The long-term psychological effects of maritime punishment extended far beyond the duration of individual voyages. Men who returned to their families after months or years at sea often carried with them emotional scars that shape their relationships and behavior for the rest of their lives. The psychological adaptation required for survival in the harsh world of maritime discipline did not easily translate back to civilian life. The letter collections preserved in the Amsterdam City Archives include correspondence from sailors, wives, and families that provide poignant insight into these lasting effects. Maria van Houten, writing to her sister about her husband's return from a 3-year voyage to the Indies, describes changes that go far beyond physical aging. Peter has returned to us in body, but his spirit seems to remain at sea. Starts at sudden sounds, shows little patience with the children's normal misbehavior, and seems most comfortable when he is alone. The gentleman I married has been replaced by someone harder, more distant, as if the experiences of his voyage have built walls around his heart that even his family cannot breach. The psychological impact of punishment was not uniformly negative, however. Some men found in the harsh discipline of maritime life a structure and clarity that they had never experienced ashore. For individuals who had struggled with the complexities and ambiguities of civilian life, the clear expectations and immediate consequences of shipboard discipline could provide a form of liberation. Cornelis Bakker, a former apprentice baker who had run afoul of guild regulations and found himself blacklisted from his trade, discovered in maritime service a sense of purpose and belonging that had eluded him on land. Despite enduring several minor punishments during his first voyage, he chose to sign on for additional voyages, eventually rising to the position of boatswain's mate. Molinier's final assessment of Bakker's transformation reveals the complex ways in which maritime punishment could serve constructive psychological functions. Bakker has found in the ship's discipline something that civilian society could not provide: a clear path to respect and advancement based on performance rather than birth or connections. The punishments he has endured have taught him lessons about responsibility and self-control that he never learned ashore. In accepting the ship's authority over his body, he has gained mastery over his own impulses and desires. The psychological dynamics of maritime punishment were also shaped by cultural expectations about masculinity and honor that pervaded 18th-century Dutch society. Men were expected to endure physical pain without complaint, to accept correction with dignity, and to demonstrate their character through their response to adversity. These cultural norms could either intensify or mitigate the psychological impact of punishment, depending on how successfully individual sailors managed to live up to societal expectations. The concept of honor provided a framework that could transform the experience of punishment from pure victimization into a test of character. A man who accepted his correction with courage and dignity could emerge from the experience with his reputation enhanced rather than diminished. Conversely, a man who showed cowardice or self-pity in the face of punishment might find his standing Among his peers, permanently damaged. The case of Garrett Boss, experienced sailor who had served on multiple voyages, illustrates how cultural concepts of honor could be manipulated to serve the psychological functions of discipline. When Boss was caught in a serious breach of regulations, he faced a choice between accepting severe punishment or attempting to justify his actions through excuses and appeals for mercy. Boss chose to accept his punishment without protest. A brief speech before the assembled crew in which he acknowledged his fault and expressed gratitude for the opportunity to make amends through suffering. This response transformed what could have been a humiliating experience into a demonstration of character that actually enhanced his reputation among his fellow sailors. Millenniers' reflection on this incident reveals the complex psychological calculations that experienced sailors learned to make. Boss understood that his response to punishment would be remembered long after the physical pain was forgotten. By accepting his correction with dignity, he transformed a moment of weakness into a demonstration of strength. His punishment became not a mark of shame, but a badge of honor that testified to his ability to face consequences like a man. Psychological impact of maritime punishment extended beyond individual sailors to shape the collective mental life of entire ship's companies. The shared experience of witnessing and enduring harsh discipline created a form of communal trauma that influenced group dynamics, decision-making, and the development of informal codes of behavior that supplemented official regulations. Ships developed their own psychological cultures, influenced by the personality of their officers, the severity of their disciplinary practices, and the particular mix of personalities that made up their crews. Some vessels became known as happy ships, where morale remained high despite the harsh necessities of maritime discipline. Others developed reputations as floating hells, where the psychological atmosphere was poisoned by excessive brutality or unfair treatment. As we prepare to examine the historical forces that eventually led to the decline of these extreme forms of maritime punishment, it's important to recognize that their psychological impact extended far beyond the individuals who directly experienced them. The mental adaptations required for survival in this harsh environment shaped entire generations of men who carried their experiences back to families, communities, and civilian occupations throughout the Dutch Republic. The psychological legacy of maritime punishment influenced not just the men who endured it, but the broader culture that produced and sustained these practices. In the gradual evolution away from the most extreme forms of physical correction, we can trace not just changing ideas about justice and humanity, but a growing understanding of the psychological costs that such practices imposed on both individuals and society as a whole. Chapter 13. Decline of peculiar punishments. The transformation of maritime discipline was not a sudden revolution, but a gradual evolution, like the slow shift of ocean currents that eventually reshape entire coastlines. By the final decades of the 18th century, the winds of change were stirring across the maritime world, carrying with them new ideas about human dignity, the nature of authority, and the proper relationship between those who commanded and those who served. The peculiar punishments that had governed Dutch ships for centuries began to seem not just harsh, but archaic remnants of a bygone age. The seeds of change were planted in multiple soils. The Enlightenment, with its emphasis on reason, human dignity, and the perfectibility of social institutions, provided an intellectual framework that questioned the traditional assumptions underlying maritime punishment. Dutch scholars and reformers, influenced by the writings of philosophers like Voltaire, Montesquieu, and later Cesare Beccaria, began to examine their maritime customs with increasingly critical eyes. Dr. Johannes van der Meer, a physician and social reformer from Amsterdam, published in 1784 an influential pamphlet titled Observations on the Correction of Sailors, which challenged the fundamental assumptions underlying traditional maritime discipline. Van der Meer had served as a ship's surgeon on several voyages to the East Indies, and his medical training gave him unique insight into the physical and psychological effects of corporal punishment. Often produce not correction but corruption, Van der Meer wrote. The sailor who is brutalized by excessive discipline becomes himself brutal, carrying the violence he has experienced into all his subsequent relationships. Far from creating order, such practices often destroy the very qualities of character: loyalty, initiative, and genuine respect for authority that are most essential to effective seamanship. Vandermeer's critique was particularly powerful, because it came not from abstract philosophical principles, but from practical medical observation. He documented cases where excessive punishment had created lasting physical disabilities, psychological disorders, and patterns of behavior that made men less rather than more effective as sailors. His work provided concrete evidence that the traditional justifications for harsh discipline, necessity, effectiveness, moral instruction were increasingly questionable. The American Revolution and its aftermath introduced another source of pressure for reform. Dutch merchants and naval officers who had contact with American privateers and naval vessels reported that these ships maintained effective discipline with significantly less physical punishment than was common in European navies. The success of American maritime ventures challenged the assumption that harsh correction was essential for maintaining order at sea. Captain Willem Scholten, writing in his memoir of the period, describes his surprise at observing the operations of the American privateer Enterprise during a brief encounter in Caribbean waters in 1782. The American captain, a man named Joshua Collins, invited me aboard his vessel to discuss matters of mutual interest. I was astonished to discover that his crew, though obviously disciplined and effective, bore none of the marks of harsh treatment that would be expected aboard a European vessel. When I inquired about his methods of maintaining order, Collins explained that his men served voluntarily for shares of prize money, and that he had found that treating them with respect and fairness produced better results than the rope's end. The practical success of such alternative approaches to discipline could not be ignored by Dutch maritime authorities, who were always sensitive to questions of competitive advantage in the international struggle for trade and naval supremacy. If other nations could maintain effective discipline with less brutal methods, perhaps the traditional Dutch approach was not as necessary as had long been assumed. Economic factors also contributed to the pressure for reform. The expansion of maritime trade and the increasing complexity of naval technology required sailors with higher levels of skill and education than had been typical in earlier generations. The brutal discipline that might be appropriate for managing pressed men or desperate criminals was less suitable for the skilled craftsmen and technical specialists that modern sailing required. The rise of specialized naval schools and formal training programs created a new class of professional sailors who expected to be treated with the respect appropriate to their expertise. These men were less likely to accept arbitrary or excessive punishment, and their skills made them too valuable to risk losing through harsh discipline that might drive them to seek employment with other nations. Adrian Hooft, director of the Dutch Naval Academy, established in Amsterdam in 1785, articulated this new perspective in his annual report to the Admiralty. The modern sailor must be not merely obedient, but intelligent, not merely strong, but skilled, not merely loyal, but capable of independent judgment in complex situations. Such men cannot be produced through the crude methods of correction that sufficed for earlier generations. They require education, encouragement, and the kind of respect that calls forth their best efforts rather than merely suppressing their worst impulses. The influence of religious reform movements also played a significant role in changing attitudes toward punishment. The Pietist revival that swept through Dutch Protestant churches in the late 18th century emphasized personal transformation through spiritual awakening rather than external correction through physical suffering. This theological shift naturally extended to questions of maritime discipline. Domini Jacobus Van Manon, an influential Reformed pastor who served as chaplain aboard several East India Company vessels, became a leading advocate for more humane approaches to maintaining shipboard discipline. His sermons and writings argued that true reformation of character required internal change that could not be produced through external force. The purpose of correction, Van Manen preached, is not to break a man's will, but to awaken his conscience. The sailor whose obedience springs from fear alone remains fundamentally unreformed, ready to transgress again whenever he believes he can escape detection. But the man whose behavior is guided by genuine understanding of right and wrong becomes a source of strength to his entire community. Van Manen's approach emphasized counseling, education, and moral persuasion as alternatives to physical punishment. While he did not advocate the complete abandonment of corporal correction, he argued for its use only as a last resort when other methods had failed. His success in maintaining discipline aboard the ships he served demonstrated the practical viability of his more humane approach. The gradual professionalization of naval service also contributed to changing attitudes toward punishment. As officers increasingly came from specialized military schools rather than learning their trade through practical experience, they brought with them more systematic approaches to leadership and discipline that emphasized training and development. Rather than mere correction, the establishment of formal codes of naval law, influenced by civilian legal reforms, introduced concepts of due process and proportionality that limited the arbitrary authority of individual captains. The old system, where a captain's word was absolute law and his interpretation of appropriate punishment was rarely questioned, gave way to more standardized procedures that provided some protection for ordinary sailors against excessive or unfair treatment. Lieutenant Cornelis van Houten, a graduate of the new Naval Academy, represents this emerging generation of professional officers. His service record, preserved in the Admiralty archives, shows a systematic approach to discipline that relied far more on training, clear communication of expectations, and graduated responses to misbehavior than on the harsh physical corrections that had characterized earlier periods. Van Houten's methods, recorded in his official reports, emphasized prevention of problems through good leadership rather than correction of problems through punishment. I have found that most disciplinary issues can be prevented through careful attention to the welfare and training of the men under my command. A sailor who understands his duties, believes his officers care about his welfare, and sees opportunities for advancement through good service is far less likely to require correction than one who feels neglected, abused, or hopeless about his prospects. Influence of international law and diplomatic considerations also played a role in moderating the harshest aspects of maritime punishment. As naval warfare became more regulated and the treatment of prisoners of war became subject to international agreements, it became increasingly difficult to justify treating one's own sailors more harshly than enemy captives. The rise of maritime, insurance, and commercial law created another source of pressure for reform. Insurance companies and merchant investors began to recognize that ships with reputations for excessive brutality had difficulty recruiting and retaining skilled crews, making them less reliable and more expensive to operate. Market forces thus aligned with humanitarian concerns to encourage more moderate approaches to discipline. The French Revolution and its aftermath accelerated these trends by challenging traditional assumptions about authority and hierarchy throughout European society. While the Dutch Republic was not directly swept up in revolutionary fervor, the radical ideas emanating from France could not be entirely contained within national boundaries. Dutch sailors, like their counterparts throughout Europe, were exposed to new concepts of human rights and dignity that made traditional forms of punishment seem increasingly obsolete. The practical effects of these various pressures for reform can be traced through the official records and regulations issued by Dutch maritime authorities during the final decades of the 18th century. New regulations issued in 1795 placed significant restrictions on the use of corporal punishment, requiring written justification for any correction more severe than 6 strokes of the rope's end, and mandating the presence of witnesses for all formal punishments. These regulatory changes reflected not just changing attitudes, but also practical recognition that the old system of arbitrary punishment was becoming counterproductive. Ships that maintained the harshest disciplinary practices found it increasingly difficult to recruit crews, while those that adopted more moderate approaches often experienced improved morale and performance. The transition was not uniform across the Dutch maritime establishment. Some old-school captains and officers resisted the changes, arguing that any relaxation of traditional discipline would lead to chaos and mutiny. Their concerns were not entirely without foundation, as several incidents during the 1790s seemed to confirm their warnings about the dangers of excessive leniency. The mutiny aboard the Dutch frigate Batavia in 1797, which some attributed to overly permissive discipline, provided ammunition for those who opposed reform. However, careful investigation revealed that the uprising was motivated more by legitimate grievances about pay and conditions than by any failure of authority, and that the relatively mild punishments aboard the ship had actually delayed rather than precipitated the crisis. By the early years of the 19th century, the transformation was largely complete. While corporal punishment remained part of maritime discipline, the extreme practices that had characterized earlier generations' kill hauling, prolonged confinement in bilge water, elaborate humiliation rituals had largely disappeared from Dutch naval practice. The rope's end and occasional formal flogging remained, but they were administered within a framework of regulations and procedures that provided significant protection against abuse. The emergence of new forms of punishment that emphasized restriction of privileges rather than infliction of pain reflected the changing character of maritime service. Sailors who misbehaved might find themselves confined to ship, deprived of shore leave, assigned to unpleasant duties, or docked pay. But they were less likely to face the kind of physical brutality that had been routine in earlier generations. This transformation represented more than just a change in disciplinary methods. It reflected a fundamental shift in understanding about the nature of authority, the dignity of human beings, and the proper relationship between those who commanded and those who served. The peculiar punishments that had once seemed both necessary and natural came to be seen as relics of a less enlightened age. As we prepare to examine the lasting legacy of these maritime customs, it's worth noting that their decline was neither sudden nor complete. Elements of the old disciplinary culture persisted well into the 19th century, and some practices continued in modified forms even longer. The transformation we have traced was part of a broader evolution in human understanding about justice, dignity, and the proper limits of authority that continues to influence maritime law and practice to this day. Chapter 14: Legacy of Maritime Discipline. Echoes of 18th-century Dutch maritime punishment reverberate through time, like the sound of distant cannon fire across calm waters. Long after the last keel hauling was performed, long after the final ritualized humiliation was enacted on the deck of a Dutch vessel, the principles, practices, and profound questions raised by these maritime customs continued to shape how human societies organize themselves, maintain order, balance the competing demands of individual dignity and collective survival. To understand this enduring legacy, we must first recognize that the maritime world of the 18th century served as a laboratory for social organization under extreme conditions. The lessons learned in those wooden worlds about leadership, discipline, justice, and human nature were carried back to land by the thousands of men who served at sea, influencing civilian institutions, legal systems, and cultural attitudes in ways both obvious and subtle. The most direct legacy of maritime discipline can be traced through the development of modern naval law and military justice systems. The careful balance between authority and restraint that Dutch maritime customs had evolved through centuries of practical experience provided a foundation for more systematic approaches to military discipline that emerged in the 19th and 20th centuries. Admiral Jan Hendrik van Kinsbergen, who served as the commanding officer of the Dutch Navy during the early years of the 19th century, explicitly drew upon traditional maritime practices when drafting new regulations for the modernized Dutch fleet. However, his synthesis was selective, preserving the principles of clear hierarchy, immediate consequence, and collective responsibility while discarding the most brutal methods of enforcement. The wisdom of our maritime ancestors. Van Kinsbergen wrote in his influential treatise, Principles of Naval Command, published in 1815, lay not in their specific methods of punishment, which often reflected the crude understanding of their time, but in their recognition that effective discipline must serve the welfare of the entire community. The captain who rules through fear alone commands only bodies, not hearts and minds. True authority inspires willing obedience by demonstrating that individual sacrifice serves collective benefit. Van Kinsbergen's approach influenced naval reforms throughout Europe and North America. As other nations studied Dutch innovations in military justice, the concept of graduated punishment, the emphasis on restoration rather than mere retribution, and the integration of disciplinary procedures with broader educational goals became standard features of modern military law. The legacy extended beyond purely military contexts into civilian criminal justice systems. The Dutch Republic's experience with maritime discipline contributed to broader European discussions about the purpose and methods of punishment that ultimately influenced the development of modern penology. The recognition that excessive punishment often produced the opposite of its intended effects, that individual circumstances should influence the severity of correction, and that the goal of justice should be restoration rather than vengeance, all had roots in maritime experience. The writings of Peter van der Hoop, an Amsterdam magistrate whose father had served as a ship's captain, explicitly connected maritime discipline with civilian criminal justice. In his Reflections on the Reform of Punishment, published in 1823, van der Hoop argued that land-based courts could learn valuable lessons from the maritime world about the practical administration of justice. Aboard ship, van der Hoop observed, punishment must be swift, fair, and clearly connected to the offense, because the offender and his judges must continue to live and work together in close quarters. These same principles, properly adapted, could transform our civilian courts from instruments of vengeance into tools of social restoration. The influence of maritime customs extended into the realm of industrial management and labor relations as the Dutch economy evolved from primarily maritime to increasingly industrial during the 19th century. Factory owners and supervisors, many of whom came from maritime backgrounds, brought with them concepts of leadership and workforce management that had been refined through generations of experience at sea. The paternalistic approach that characterized the best maritime commanders combining firm discipline with genuine concern for subordinates' welfare became a model for enlightened industrial management. Companies that adopted these principles often found that they could maintain productivity and order with less harsh supervision than their competitors who relied on purely authoritarian methods. Johannes van den Berg, who managed one of Amsterdam's largest textile factories in the 1840s after serving as a ship's officer in his youth, articulated this connection explicitly. "I learned at sea that men work best when they understand their purpose, trust their leaders, and believe that their individual efforts contribute to collective success." The same principles that maintain discipline aboard ship in the middle of the ocean can maintain order in a factory filled with the noise of machinery and the press of production deadlines. The educational legacy of maritime discipline proved equally significant. The Dutch system's emphasis on punishment as education rather than mere retribution influenced the development of pedagogy in schools, reform institutions, and other educational contexts. The recognition that correction should be designed to teach specific lessons rather than simply inflict suffering became a cornerstone of progressive educational theory. Dr. Antonius van der Palm, who served as director of several reform schools for troubled youth during the 1850s, explicitly modeled his disciplinary practices on maritime customs he had studied through extensive interviews with retired naval officers. His approach emphasized clear expectations, immediate consequences, and the integration of punishment with broader educational goals. The ship's captain, who must transform a collection of disparate individuals into an effective crew, faces the same essential challenge as the schoolmaster, who must mold unruly children into productive citizens. Van der Palm wrote, "Both must find ways to balance firmness with fairness, authority with compassion, immediate correction with long-term development." The psychological insights developed through maritime experience also contributed to emerging understanding of human behavior under stress, the dynamics of group leadership, and the factors that promote or undermine social cohesion. Dutch physicians and philosophers who studied maritime customs provided some of the earliest systematic observations of what would later be recognized as psychological phenomena such as group dynamics, leadership psychology, and the effects of environmental stress on human behavior. The work of Dr. Willem Vrolijk, prominent Amsterdam physician who served as ship surgeon on several voyages before pursuing an academic career. Provided pioneering insights into what would later be called military psychology. His detailed observations of how different personality types responded to maritime discipline, how group morale influenced individual behavior, and how leadership styles affected crew performance anticipated many concepts that would not be formally recognized by psychology until the 20th century. The ship, Verolic wrote in his medical observations on life at sea, published in 1835, provides a natural laboratory for studying human behavior under controlled conditions. The lessons learned in this environment about motivation, leadership, and social organization have applications far beyond the maritime world. The cultural legacy of maritime discipline extended into literature, art, and popular culture, where the image of the ship's captain became a powerful symbol of leadership under extreme conditions. Dutch authors, painters, and playwrights drew upon maritime themes to explore broader questions about authority, justice, and human nature that resonated with audiences far removed from the sea. The novels of Jacob van Lennep, particularly his The Ship's Carpenter, published in 1859, used maritime settings to examine moral questions about the proper use of authority and the relationship between individual rights and collective needs. Van Lennep's portrayal of ship captains as complex figures, struggling to balance competing demands, reflected the sophisticated understanding of leadership that had developed through centuries of maritime experience. The international influence of Dutch maritime customs extended through the global reach of Dutch trade and colonization. In the East Indies, the Americas, and other regions where Dutch presence was significant, local administrative practices were influenced by concepts of authority and discipline that had been refined in the maritime world. The colonial administration of the Dutch East Indies, in particular, showed clear influence from maritime disciplinary practices in its emphasis on clear hierarchy, immediate correction of violations, and the integration of punishment with broader educational and administrative goals. While the colonial context introduced its own complexities and moral problems, the underlying administrative principles reflected centuries of maritime experience in managing diverse populations under challenging conditions. Governor-General Johannes van den Bosch, who served in the East Indies during the 1830s, explicitly acknowledged this connection. The principles that govern a well-ordered ship-clear command structure, predictable consequences for violations, and genuine concern for the welfare of all hands must guide our administration of these distant territories. We cannot rule effectively through fear alone, but must demonstrate that our authority serves the common good. The legal legacy of maritime discipline proved particularly enduring. Concepts such as the captain's authority in emergencies, the principle that circumstances should influence punishment, and the idea that disciplinary procedures should serve restorative rather than merely punitive functions, became embedded in maritime law and influenced civilian legal systems throughout the world. The development of international maritime law during the 19th and 20th centuries drew heavily upon Dutch precedents and practices. The Hague Conventions on Maritime Warfare, the early international agreements on the treatment of shipwrecked sailors, and the evolution of admiralty law all reflected principles that had been developed through centuries of Dutch maritime experience. Perhaps most significantly, the Dutch experience with maritime discipline contributed to evolving understanding of human rights and the proper limits of authority. The recognition that even in extreme circumstances, surrounded by water, dependent on cooperation for survival, far from any external authority, there must be limits to the power that individuals can exercise over others became an important precedent for later developments in human rights, law, and constitutional theory. The philosophical legacy of maritime discipline extended into political theory and constitutional law through the work of scholars who recognized that the ship represented a unique form of political community, the temporary but absolute authority granted to ship captains, balanced by customary limitations and the practical need to maintain crew morale, provided a model for thinking about emergency powers in civilian government. Hugo Grotius, though, writing in an earlier period, had established the intellectual framework for thinking about maritime law. As a distinct branch of jurisprudence with its own principles and precedents, later, Dutch legal theorists built upon this foundation to develop concepts of legitimate authority, due process, and proportional punishment that influenced constitutional development throughout Europe and North America. As the maritime world evolved through steam power, international regulation, and changing concepts of labor relations, the specific practices we have examined disappeared from active use. However, the underlying principles they represented the need to balance individual dignity with collective survival. The importance of swift and fair justice, the recognition that authority derives its legitimacy from service to the common good remained relevant to human societies facing new challenges and opportunities. In modern maritime law, military justice systems, educational institutions, and corporate management practices, we can still trace the influence of lessons learned. Aboard Dutch ships in the 18th century, the specific forms may have changed, but the fundamental questions about how human beings should organize themselves, maintain order, and treat one another with both firmness and dignity continue to resonate across the centuries as we prepare. To conclude our exploration of these maritime customs, it's worth reflecting on what this legacy suggests about the nature of human institutions and the possibilities for moral progress. The evolution from the harsh practices of the 18th century to more humane approaches to discipline and authority represents not just a change in methods, but a deepening understanding of human dignity and the proper purposes of social organization. Chapter 15. A gentle farewell at sea as our journey together draws to its close. Like a great ship approaching harbor after months upon the endless ocean, it is time to gather the threads of this strange and sometimes troubling tapestry we have woven together. The peculiar punishments that once echoed across the wooden decks of Dutch vessels have long since faded into the gentle murmur of historical memory. But their lessons remain as relevant to the human condition as the eternal rhythm of waves against a whole picture, if you will. The scene aboard a Dutch merchantman as she makes her final approach to the familiar waters of the Zuider Zee. The sun hangs low on the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose that reflect like scattered coins upon the water's surface. The harsh urgencies that have driven the ship's company for months across dangerous seas have given way to a different kind of anticipation, the quiet excitement of homecoming. The prospect of familiar faces and solid ground beneath tired feet. On deck, sailors who have shared hardships and witnessed punishments together now stand quietly at the rail, lost in his own thoughts about the voyage ending and the life waiting ashore. The divisions between officers and crew, between punisher and punished, between the stern necessities of maritime discipline and the gentler rhythms of civilian life, seem somehow less important now, softened by distance and the approaching promise of peace. The captain, that figure who has wielded such absolute authority over these wooden domains, now appears less as a distant embodiment of power and more as a fellow traveler completing a shared journey. His responsibilities have not diminished. A ship is not safely home until her anchor is securely set and her cargo properly delivered, but the quality of his authority has somehow changed, becoming less about dominance and more about stewardship, less about punishment and more about safe passage. This transformation reflects something profound about the nature of the customs we have examined together. The harsh realities of maritime discipline were never ends in themselves, but means toward larger purposes, the preservation of life, the completion of voyages, the maintenance of the delicate cooperation required for survival in humanity's most challenging environment. As those immediate purposes near fulfillment, the methods employed to achieve them can be set aside, like tools no longer needed once the work is done. The young sailor who endured the rope's end for sleeping on watch stands now as a competent seaman, his punishment long forgotten by all, save perhaps himself, where it remains not as a source of bitterness, but as a memory of learning, a reminder of how discipline shaped him into someone capable of shouldering genuine responsibility. The officer who administered that correction has moved beyond seeing him as a problem to be solved and now recognizes him as a valuable member of the ship's community, proven through the shared trials of the voyage. In the ship's wake, invisible, but somehow present, trail the ghosts of all the maritime customs we have explored, the theatrical humiliations, the ritual punishments, the complex ceremonies of correction and restoration that once seemed so crucial to maintaining order in these floating worlds. They have served their purpose and can now rest. Like duty-weary sentries whose watch has finally ended, the Bilgewater trials that once seemed so bizarre now appear as elaborate attempts to create meaningful consequences for meaningless infractions, to transform the arbitrary miseries of life at sea into teaching moments that might prevent more serious problems. The mock trials and public humiliations reveal themselves as sophisticated forms of community theater. It's designed to reinforce social bonds and shared values without the permanent damage that more severe punishments might inflict, even the most extreme practices, the dreaded keel hauling, the formal floggings, the isolation and degradation ceremonies can be understood as desperate attempts to preserve civilization under circumstances that constantly threaten to reduce human beings to their most basic and selfish impulses. They were not perfect solutions, and they often failed to achieve their intended purposes. But they represented genuine efforts to maintain something precious and fragile in the face of forces that cared nothing for human dignity or social order. The religious framework that gave meaning to so much maritime punishment has also evolved, not disappearing but transforming into something more subtle and perhaps more genuinely spiritual. The Calvinist certainty that once made suffering seem like divine correction has given way to a more complex understanding, how human beings learn and grow through experience. The rigid morality that saw punishment as God's will operating through earthly authority has softened into recognition that divine love might work as powerfully through mercy as through correction. As the ship approaches her berth, the physical traces of the voyage's hardships are already beginning to fade. The salt stains will be scrubbed away, the worn rigging will be replaced, the scarred planks will be sanded smooth and painted fresh. But the deeper changes wrought by months of shared experience, the bonds forged between men who have depended on each other for survival, the wisdom gained through confronting the limits of human endurance, the understanding of how individual actions affect collective welfare. These will endure long after the physical evidence has been erased. The sailors preparing for discharge carry with them more than their sea chests and accumulated pay. They bear the invisible cargo of experience that will influence every subsequent relationship, every future challenge, every moment when they must choose between selfish convenience and responsible action. The harsh lessons of maritime discipline have become part of their character, not as trauma, but as education, not as limitation, but as liberation from the kind of thoughtless behavior that endangers both self and community, their families. At the dock, with mixtures of joy and apprehension, may struggle to understand the changes they observe in these returning voyagers. The boy who left has returned as a man, marked not just by sun and wind, but by exposure to responsibilities and consequences that most people never experience. The easy laughter may be tempered by deeper understanding. The casual confidence may be balanced by genuine humility. Quick anger may be controlled by hard-won wisdom about the true costs of conflict. These changes represent the ultimate purpose of all the strange customs we have examined. The peculiar punishments of Dutch maritime service were never about satisfying some abstract principle of justice or expressing the arbitrary will of those in authority. They were about transformation, the conversion of individuals into community members, the evolution of boys into men, the development of character capable of functioning effectively under the most challenging circumstances imaginable. The merchant captain completing his final log entries as the ship approaches harbor understands this transformation in ways that those who remained ashore cannot. He has watched men change under the pressure of maritime discipline, has seen cowards become heroes, and heroes humbled into wisdom. His authority over these men is ending once they step ashore. They will be free to choose their own paths, but the influence he has exercised over their development will continue to shape their lives in ways both large and small. The legacy of maritime discipline extends far beyond the individuals who directly experienced it. The principles learned aboard ship, that authority must be balanced by responsibility, that individual actions have collective consequences, that true strength comes from the ability to endure hardship without losing one's humanity, have influenced the development of institutions, laws, and cultural practices throughout the modern world. The democratic ideals that have shaped our contemporary understanding of justice and human rights owe something to the hard-won wisdom of those who learned to govern and be governed in the extreme circumstances of life at sea. The recognition that even absolute authority must be exercised within moral limits, that punishment should serve educational rather than merely retributive purposes, that human dignity must be preserved even in the harshest circumstances. These insights were forged in the crucible of maritime experience and tested by generations of men who had no choice but to make them work. As our imagined ship settles into her berth and the bustle of arrival begins, the extraordinary circumstances that made harsh discipline seem necessary fade into ordinary concerns about cargo manifests, customs inspections, and shore leave schedules. The wooden world that has been our focus returns to being simply a means of transportation, a commercial enterprise, a collection of timber and canvas and rope serving human purposes. But for those who have shared this journey of understanding, something has changed. The seemingly arbitrary and often brutal customs we have examined have revealed themselves as expressions of deeper truths about human nature, social organization, and the endless challenge of living together in harmony despite our individual weaknesses and conflicting desires, the peculiar punishments that once seemed so foreign to our modern sensibilities now appear as ancestors to our own institutions and practices. The school disciplinary codes that shape our children's character, the corporate policies that govern our workplaces, the legal systems that maintain order in our communities, all bear traces of wisdom learned aboard ships like the ones we have virtually visited together. Perhaps most importantly, we've discovered that the apparent opposites of mercy and justice, of individual dignity and collective welfare, of firm authority and genuine compassion, need not be irreconcilable. The best maritime commanders learn to balance these competing demands not through rigid DZD formulas, but through the kind of practical wisdom that comes from accepting responsibility for other people's welfare, under circumstances where failure could mean death for all. As the sun sets over our imagined harbor and the sounds of celebration drift across the water from sailors reunited with their families, we too can rest in the satisfaction of a journey completed. The harsh realities we have examined together are softened by distance and understanding. It's like sharp rocks worn smooth by the endless action of the waves. The men who endured these strange punishments have long since returned to dust. Experience continues to speak to us across the centuries, reminding us that human dignity can survive even the harshest treatment, that wisdom can emerge from suffering, and that the greatest punishment of all might be the isolation that comes from being cut off from the community of fellow human beings struggling together toward better understanding of themselves and each other. In the gentle darkness that follows sunset at sea, when the stars emerge one by one to guide vessels safely through the night, we can imagine those long-ago sailors finally at peace. Their struggles with discipline and authority, with justice and mercy, with individual desire and collective responsibility, have become part of the larger story of human moral development that continues to unfold in our own time. The waves that once carried their ships to distant shores continue to roll endlessly against coastlines around the world, bearing new generations of travelers toward their own encounters with the fundamental challenges of living together in harmony. The lessons learned aboard those floating communities of the past remain available to guide us, not as rigid rules, but as hard-won wisdom about the possibilities and limitations of human nature. And so, as our own voyage of discovery draws to its close, we can rest peacefully in the knowledge that understanding, however partial and imperfect, has been achieved. The peculiar punishments that once seemed so strange and troubling have revealed their deeper purposes and taken their proper place in the long history of human attempts to create justice, maintain order, and preserve dignity under the most challenging circumstances imaginable. In the quiet of this ending, we can hear the eternal rhythm of the sea, carrying away the echoes of old pain and bringing the promise of new understanding. The wooden ships have long since returned to the elements from which they were made, but the lessons they taught about courage, discipline, mercy, and the endless possibility of human growth and transformation remain as fresh and relevant as the morning tide. Sleep well, gentle listener, carried by these ancient rhythms toward your own harbor of peace and understanding.